Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Parallel Deku, back with another fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Had the Molten Shadow Quirk. Now before starting, please give this video a like. And subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Deku's quirk was called Molten Shadow. He could manipulate shadows and fire at will and could produce black flames that burned hotter than normal. The drawbacks were clear. If he used the fire too much he would pass out, and his shadow manipulation was significantly weaker in sunlight. When he was a child, Midoriya's mother instructed him to be a good boy, to go into the closet and not make a sound. He nodded and she closed the door, leaving him alone in the dark. He waited, listening to his own breathing. After a few minutes a loud crash reached him and his breath hitched, but he stayed put because his mother had told him to. Tears slipped down his face as he heard shouting from the living room. He only wanted the commotion to end so they could watch the All Might special together. After a long moment of silence, Midoriya opened the closet door and crept toward the living room, hoping to see his mother. Instead he saw a man standing over her. The man scoffed at Midoriya and said he had been told there were no children in the house, then called for the boy to come closer. Midoriya was frozen with fear and shook his head. The man laughed and repeated the command, making clear that Midoriya had no choice. Midoriya stepped forward, forced by fear, and saw his mother lying motionless on the couch. The sight drained the color from his face and he began to scream. The man barked at him, demanding obedience and warning that consequences would follow if Midoriya told anyone. He mocked the boy's name, then warned him again not to tell the police before leaving. Once the man was gone, Midoriya collapsed beside his mother and sobbed, trying desperately to help but realizing she was already gone. He cried until exhaustion overtook him and he fell asleep. Later, when other people arrived at the house, Midoriya panicked and used his quirk to create a shadowy barrier that pushed them back. He unintentionally threw one responder against a wall before the power faded. Terrified, he buried his face against his mother's chest. The pro-heroes entered and identified themselves as there to help. In different circumstances he would have been thrilled to see them, but now he could barely respond. A hero asked him who had done this, but Midoriya refused to speak, still terrified of the intruder's threat. One of the heroes All Might tried to coax him, offering a hand to help him up and asking his name. Midoriya answered shakily. When pressed to reveal the attacker, he repeated that he could not. All Might's patience frayed. He explained that the man had been a long-sought criminal and that the boy's testimony could be crucial. Feeling frustrated and not understanding the boy's silence, All Might said that the boy's silence made it difficult to help and then stepped away, muttering that they would take it from there. Left alone with his grief and the weight of blame, Midoriya felt himself break inside. Years later, Midoriya walked into school each morning bracing for the abuse he expected. He believed he deserved it for failing to stop the man who killed his mother. Teachers often looked the other way, and sometimes even joined in the bullying. He could have fought back, but he saw himself as a disappointment, already failing his hero idol in his own eyes. On one day, as he entered his classroom, he felt the hostile stares and braced himself. Bakugo grabbed his collar and hauled him out of his desk, demanding that Midoriya look at him. Bakugo's friends added taunts, and one of them spat a cruel remark. Midoriya kept his eyes on the floor and accepted the humiliation. Bakugo used his quirk to hit him in the face and then kicked him repeatedly while taunting him, asking if he liked it. Midoriya endured the beating in silence, numb and resigned. Finally, the bell rang. The teacher Mrs. Saito sighed and told Midoriya to get in his seat because he was disturbing the class. Midoriya faked a stutter to preserve the illusion of the weak, quirkless kid who could do nothing. He kept his quirk hidden because his mother had feared that showing it would bring his father back into their lives. He thought bitterly that his father could not take him from anyone now, and he briefly tempted himself with the idea of revealing who the quirkless nerd really was before pushing the thought away. The rest of the day felt like a gauntlet. Each PRD brought more mockery, shoving, and degradation. At the final bell, most students left, but Midoriya was forced into his seat by Kaken and his friends. Bakugo sneered and demanded to know what he had done earlier in class, and he told Midoriya to get out of his sight and stop wasting everyone's time. After Bakugo and his cronies left, Midoriya sat alone, turning Bakugo's words over in his head and fighting off dark thoughts of escape, reminding himself that those thoughts would not help. Bakugo waited outside the school gate for a few minutes, intending to leave but deciding to wait for Midoriya. When Midoriya had not appeared, Bakugo went back to the classroom. He peeked through the door and saw Midoriya frozen in thought. Bakugo called out, prompting Midoriya to stammer a denial. Bakugo demanded to know why he was still there and warned him about being late for his aunt, Inko. Midoriya tried to answer, and Bakugo laughed and began to walk away, but then he noticed bandages peeking out from Midoriya's sleeve. Bakugo put his hand in the doorway to stop Midoriya and asked about the bandages. Midoriya's face went blank for a moment and then he muttered that it was nothing. He pushed past Bakugo and ran down the stairs. Bakugo watched him go, unsettled and wondering what Midoriya was hiding. Midoriya walked home in silence, replaying the day's events and regretting that he had let Bakugo see the bandages and that he had not kept up his stutter when challenged. His mother's death had left him devastated, and over the years he had grown into a withdrawn young man who rarely showed emotion. He imagined what it would be like to stand up and be himself at school, but fear and habit kept him pretending. He unlocked the door to the small apartment he had purchased with his mother's leftover money and stepped inside. He had moved away from the place where his mother had been killed and now lived in a one-room apartment he could afford. Passing the living room still turned his stomach, so he kept his space small and simple. He made a grilled cheese and forced himself to eat despite the nausea. Food had been scarce lately as he rationed what he had. After washing his plate, he went to the bathroom. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw the toll of sleepless nights and stress, dark circles under hollow eyes and a pale complexion. He took a long breath and undressed to shower. In the bathroom, he carefully removed the old bandages from his arms and inspected the faint marks beneath them. He felt the pull of despair but stopped himself, reminding himself that acting on those impulses would not bring relief. He set aside the small tools he kept for caring for the wounds, wrapped his arms with fresh bandages, and put everything away safely. He dried off, dressed in boxers and an oversized shirt, and prepared for a rare day off the next morning. He settled into bed with his laptop and lost himself in a marathon of anime until the early hours. Exhaustion finally pulled him under around 4 in the morning. In his dreams he was back in a flower field playing with his mother as a child. He remembered the simple, happy moments, games of heroes and the smell of his favorite katsudon. He woke before long with tears in his eyes and the quiet ache of memory pressing on him. My mother greeted me, calling my name. My eyes started watering and I buried my face in her chest, not wanting to let go in case she would disappear if I did. I apologized, stammering that I was sorry and that I loved her. She lifted my chin and looked me in the eyes. She told me I had done nothing wrong and that she loved me, but that she had been watching me for some time. I flinched, wondering if she had seen me cutting. She told me I needed to stop cutting, that if she had been there she would have stopped me, but she could not, and she asked me to try for her. I asked how, because it felt like the only thing I had. She paused, looked at me with understanding, and said that one day I would find someone who would help me stop and fill the void, and that I should hold on until then. She reminded me that she loved me, hugged me one last time, and disappeared. I woke with tears in my eyes and sweat clinging to my skin and the covers. I groaned and pressed my hands to my head. I walked to the kitchen and checked the clock on the stove. It was 8:20 in the morning. I complained to myself about waking up so early, then shook my head and put on pants to go for a walk. The air outside was cool with a slight breeze. It was a perfect autumn morning. I walked across a bridge and watched the multicolored leaves drift into the water, captivated by the sight. A child ran past me with a kite, breaking me out of my trance. I smiled at the child's innocence and joy and wished I could return to that carefree age. Midoriya's POV. The weekend went by fast. It was spent in my depression hole watching anime. Before I knew it, it was already Monday. I was scared to go back because Kaken would probably be suspicious of me. My alarm clock read 6. I groaned, dreading the day before it even started. I put on the uniform, turned on the coffee maker, brushed my teeth, and drank some coffee. Putting on my backpack, I looked at my house one last time and left for school. The PRDS passed quickly. Strangely, Kaken's bullying was lighter than usual, with only a few insults thrown around as if he was afraid I would break. The rest of the students were a different story. I was pushed around, roughly handled, and had trash thrown on me. It was the last class of the day and I was excited to go home and finish the last episode of Parasite. I jotted down my notes and paid attention for once. I usually just saw the problems on the papers and answered them, but it was fun to follow along sometimes. We were in the middle of a nuclear fission equation when the bell rang for the students to go home. Once again I was held down by Bakugu's friends, but Bakugu himself wasn't around. One of the boys, Adachi, taunted me, saying Bakugu wasn't there to protect me and suggesting I had someone defending me because I was close to him. He used hateful insults and mocked the idea that Bakugu would stand up for me. I tried to process what he meant when a fist came flying at my face. The three boys beat me for a long time, using their quirks. I screamed every time they struck, but I stayed still because I felt I deserved it. When they finally left, they snickered at my bruised and battered state. When they left, I decided that tomorrow would be my last day. I wanted to be with my mom. I dusted myself off and made my slow, aching way home to prepare for what I planned. Bakugu's POV. Bakugo left school early so he could visit Aunt Inko before Deku and ask about the bandages. When he arrived at the apartment, a different family answered the door. He knocked and a little girl with blonde pigtails called that someone was at the door. A short woman with blonde hair came to the door carrying a dish and asked if Mrs. Midoriya lived there. The woman explained that they had been living there for a couple of years and that the previous occupant must have moved on. Bakugo was left standing there, frustrated at being kept in the dark and determined to follow Deku home the next day. Midoriya's POV. I woke up happier than ever the next morning. I had written notes to Kaken, Aunt Mitsuki, and Uncle Masaru because they were the only people I was ever close to besides Mom. I packed the notes in my backpack and walked to school with a big, calm smile. When I walked in, everyone stared at me. Usually I was small and trying to disappear. No one said much to me that day. By the end of the day I had only been insulted a couple of times. When the bell rang, Bakugo and his friends moved to stop me, but I slipped out of the class before they got the chance. I went to a nearby hotel and climbed to the roof. The school roof was locked after hours, so I settled on the hotel roof. I felt a nervous flutter knowing what I intended. I put my backpack down, took my notes out, laid them under my jacket and secured my shoes on top so they wouldn't blow away. Closing my eyes, I stepped onto the ledge and jumped. Aizawa's POV. I was on a break after a mission when I noticed a green-haired boy on the edge of a neighboring roof. My eyes widened as the boy prepared to jump. Without thinking, I launched myself and snagged him with my scarf. For a tense moment I was almost pulled off the ledge as I reached toward the adjacent building, but by some luck I managed to reel him in and bring him to safety. I muttered under my breath about the problem child as I wrapped him in my scarf and checked him over. He had no obvious injuries from the fall. I took out my phone and called my husband, unsure what else to do. My husband answered cheerfully. I told him I had just saved a student who had tried to jump and that the boy was unconscious. He reacted with alarm, insisting that I bring the student over immediately so Recovery Girl could see him and so he could help. I asked how he planned to help. He joked about his presence being uplifting, and my husband teased back that my presence tended to test one's patience. I agreed to bring the boy home and contacted Recovery Girl as I headed that way. He ended the call abruptly, then hurried to the rooftop to collect the other person's things before going home. Midoriya woke with a groan as bright light forced his eyes open. He sat bolt upright and scanned the room, disoriented, until he recognized two pro-heroes and an elderly woman, two of the heroes who had been there when his mother died. One of the heroes addressed him and called him Little Listener, and Midoriya recoiled, telling them not to use that name and beginning to hyperventilate. He felt embarrassed to be having a panic attack in front of the heroes who had pulled him back from the edge. The gruff hero stopped himself mid-word, then asked what he preferred to be called. Midoriya managed to answer that he was Midoriya. The other hero, the one who could nullify quirks, checked if Midoriya remembered why he was there. Midoriya said he knew he had tried to end his life. The hero tersely called him a problem child but only to confirm his memory. Midoriya asked where he was. The gruff hero explained that he was in the hero's home, and the elderly woman, leaning on her cane, signaled that he could leave only when she said so. Midoriya flinched when the cane moved and winced in pain. The elderly woman told him he could go, warning him not to try something like that again and suggesting his mother must be worried. Midoriya snorted at the image of his mother pacing the house. The two heroes looked confused at his amusement. He steadied himself and gathered his things, and before leaving he asked Mike, the gruff hero, if he had ever found the man who had killed his mother. Mick's face went pale and he said nothing. Midoriya left. At his apartment, Midoriya broke down and cried. Overwhelmed and ashamed, he harmed himself in ways he later bandaged and cleaned, then scrolled through social media until he fell asleep. He stayed away from school for the entire week, not going because he was too upset with himself. The school called the house assuming his mother would answer, unaware that she had been dead for years. After several days he forced himself up to get food, grabbed a strawberry popsicle, and retreated to his room to watch anime. He no longer wanted to pretend. On Monday he returned to school determined to present a different front. He stopped hiding in the shadows and adopted an unamused, distant demeanor. When people tried to bully him and threw punches, he dodged and kept walking, making their attempts feel futile and leaving them unsettled. He felt their hateful stares but no longer cared. At lunchtime he went to the roof with a small sandwich he had packed, only to find Bakugo and his friends approaching. They moved in as if preparing to pick on him, assuming he would be an easy target. Bakugo reached out to touch his shoulder as a prelude to using his quirk, but Midoriya brushed the hand away and stood. Rather than plead, Midoriya taunted them, speaking with a stammer at times, mocking their expectations and calling Bakugo out by name. The group was taken aback. Bakugo threatened to beat him up. Midoriya mocked the threat and smiled faintly. Bakugo swung and missed as Midoriya easily dodged, then left the roof with a casual gesture that further unsettled them. Midoriya decided he did not feel like staying at school and walked home without anyone stopping him. The teachers did not intervene for the student labeled quirkless, and Midoriya felt the same contempt for them in return. As he walked, a sudden, overwhelming sense of suffocation washed over him, as if he were drowning. He struggled against the feeling, and a sinister voice brushed past his thoughts, suggesting he would be taken. He forced himself to keep moving. Bakugo watched Midoriya walk through the school door and cursed under his breath, irritated that Midoriya seemed to be acting like he was in control now. Bakugo and the other students accompanying him were still reeling from Midoriya's unexpected behavior as they followed out the door. The nerd was starting to annoy me more and more as time passed. I stormed down the stairs hoping to catch Deku, but by the time I reached the classroom his bag was gone. He thought angrily that Deku had already gone home and promised himself he'd blast him to the moon next time. Soon the bell rang and he sat down. Class started and the teacher made no note of Deku being gone. He sighed and worked on his sheets until class ended. The rest of the day was a breeze. As soon as the final bell rang he jumped out of class and headed home. Extras followed him around like lost puppies when a bottle suddenly flew down in front of him and a slimy monster emerged. He froze for a moment, unsure what to do. Darkness closed in as he struggled to breathe. He set off explosions, trying to escape the creature. He shouted at it to get off him. Midoriya's point of view, a few minutes earlier. As Midoriya fought to breathe against the villain, a powerful gust of wind hit both him and the creature. He broke free from its hold and finally drew a breath. Before everything went black, he saw a familiar figure and realized it was All Might. Later, Midoriya woke to a tapping on his face and understood that All Might had thought he might have been lost. He sat up slowly with a blinding headache and then noticed the person he resented the most glaring at him. That person looked surprised by the glare, as if he could not understand why anyone would hate him. Midoriya stood and thanked him. All Might told Midoriya that there was no problem and that he had to be going. The other young man reached out toward All Might, indicating he still needed to ask a question. All Might prepared to leave carrying the villain compressed in a bottle, but the young man grabbed his leg at the last second to hold on as they rose into the air. The young man tried to shake All Might off in panic until All Might pointed out the danger of letting go. He realized the truth and held on tightly until they landed on a nearby roof. All Might advised him to bang on the door until someone let him out and reiterated that he had to deliver the villain to the police because heroes worked on a tight schedule. The young man interrupted, insisting he needed to ask one question. All Might urged him to make it quick. He asked whether, even with what some called a villainous quirk, he could ever become a hero. The young man recalled a past time when All Might had called him a villain and said he should be locked up. All Might sighed, lifted his shirt, and revealed a deep scar. He explained that he had been badly injured in a battle years ago and that those injuries had left him weakened. To answer the question, All Might said that people would fear a villainous quirk and that such a power could hurt others. He told the young man that becoming a hero would not be possible under those circumstances. He then checked for the bottle that had held the villain and realized he had dropped it, and that it had landed somewhere where civilians might be. All Might scolded the young man for making him late and for letting the villain escape. The young man apologized, but All Might said an apology would not be enough and left, inflating back into his hero form and jumping off the roof. Walking down the street afterward, the young man mulled over All Might's words. He wondered whether his quirk would make people afraid of him. To test it, he approached a stranger and asked politely if he could ask a quick question. The stranger looked wary but agreed. The young man asked whether his quirk was villainous and whether the stranger was afraid. He demonstrated by releasing black flames from his hands. The stranger was unimpressed and told him that it wasn't scary. The young man bowed and moved on, thinking bitterly that All Might was full of it. Walking farther, he heard explosions and the noise of a crowd down the street. He pushed through to see what was happening and recognized the chaos. An attack by the same slime monster from earlier. Explosions were erupting at regular intervals as someone tried to fend the creature off. He debated whether to help. The person under attack had bullied him for years, but they had been childhood friends, and heroes were supposed to save people no matter what. He decided he wanted to be a hero and prove All Might wrong, so he ran into the fray despite the warnings from the professionals. He quickly assessed the situation and aimed for the monster's eyes so the person under attack could breathe. He flung his backpack at the creature and hit it dead on, then used his quirk to heat the sludge away. The monster screamed and the crowd reacted with confusion because it looked like he was simply clawing at it. He clawed more frantically as time ran out, adding more of his power. Suddenly he felt a presence beside him and scowled when he saw All Might once more. All Might flashed his signature smile and promptly took down the nasty sewer creature. The crowd cheered as the injured person was rushed to medical attention. Two pro-heroes approached him and looked him in the eye. It felt like the narrator was a child about to be scolded. He cut Aizawa off and stood up, telling them that they had no right to lecture him. He accused them of sitting idle while the boy struggled for air and waiting for someone with a supposedly better-suited quirk to arrive. He pointed out that they had not used their heads and that he had managed to buy the boy a few precious seconds of air without using his quirk. He asked whether it had ever crossed their minds to strike the only solid target on the villain. The room was stunned into silence. He told them to stop wasting his time and walked away. Aizawa started to speak, but the narrator waved a hand and silenced him. He made it clear that he did not care what Aizawa had to say, narrowed his eyes, and left. When he got home, he let out a huge sigh. People were annoying. He slipped off his shoes, plopped onto the couch, and scrolled through short videos until the thought of doing school online popped into his head. Excited, he went to his desk, pulled up a list of online school options, and chose the most challenging program. He unenrolled from Aldra Junior High, decided he should probably find a job because he was almost out of money, and went to bed. The next day, he wandered around Muzutafu looking for work that would accept someone without a quirk or a high school education. After a couple of hours, he decided to take a break and stopped at a cat cafe. Inside he found the hobo-looking man from before cuddling every cat he could fit into his arms. The narrator coughed. The man looked up and greeted him by asking if he should be in school. The narrator explained that he had signed up for online school because he hated the other one, and that he was taking a break from job hunting. He mentioned his financial situation, and the man replied simply that he was there for the cats and the coffee. They ordered drinks and ended up talking for an hour about sleep, coffee, cats, and heroes. When they parted, the narrator felt a little empty but shook it off and resumed his search for work. He eventually landed a low-paying job at a concert venue, working from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. each day, which did not interfere with his online schooling. A couple of weeks later he met Aizawa for a third time while sweeping up after an event. Present Mike tapped his shoulder, surprising him, and chuckled at the small squeak he let out. Present Mike called him Midoriya in greeting, and Aizawa announced to a passing colleague that Midoriya was there. The narrator brightened at hearing Aizawa's name. Their previous encounter had left him feeling safer and more comfortable around the man. Aizawa greeted him familiarly as Hobo and asked what he was doing here, learning that the narrator worked at the venue. They talked about the cats and Aizawa confirmed they were fine. Present Mike watched in amazement that the narrator could be quiet and that Aizawa could speak to someone without complaint. Yamada tried to interject a few times, but the narrator and Aizawa continued their conversation until Yamada's performance began. The narrator sat through the show since his shift had ended and was surprised by how much he enjoyed it. It had more variety and structure than he had expected. They laughed together, though the joke was drowned out by a drum solo. After the show, as Yamada packed up, Aizawa grabbed the narrator's sleeve and asked him to come over for dinner since he had stayed so long. The narrator paused, then agreed. Aizawa thought to himself that he had invited the narrator over for several reasons. He liked him, he intended to ask him to become his student, and the narrator did not seem to have anyone waiting at home. Aizawa felt that it was tough on someone so young. When they returned home, the cats were lined up by the door, purring and seeking attention. Aizawa crouched to pet them, then looked back to find the narrator standing awkwardly. He urged the narrator inside. The narrator apologized and put his bag down before sinking into the couch and holding a pillow to his chest. Aizawa patted the seat beside him and explained that Hisashi had started dinner before they left and it would be ready soon. The narrator asked what they were having. Aizawa said he preferred not to know and liked to be surprised. The narrator laughed, saying he had a history of burning ramen and that he usually only ate a sandwich twice a week. Aizawa told him that he should come over for dinner every other day, and the narrator agreed. Aizawa planned to watch over him, help him, and offer a bit of stability while he considered the possibility of training him as a student. The evening settled into a quiet comfort as they waited for dinner to be served. Midoriya smiled and turned on the TV to pass the time. From Midoriya's perspective, dinner arrived and he snorted at how it looked. It appeared as if something had crawled out of the vegetable scraps, probably some kind of casserole. He hesitated but picked up his fork and took a cautious bite, bracing for the worst. To his surprise, it was not as bad as he expected. Starving, he ate quickly. He had not eaten properly in days. When he paused to take a breath, he noticed Hobo and Mike watching him. He laughed softly and set his fork down. As he wiped his face, Hobo asked if he would consider becoming Hobo's personal student. Midoriya's eyes widened at the suggestion. He asked if Hobo was serious, and when Hobo nodded, Midoriya answered enthusiastically that he wanted to start right away. It had been a couple of months of constant pressure from Aizawa. Midoriya still had a few months to go before the entrance exam for UA. He wondered aloud why he had signed up for the training in the first place. Aizawa dismissed his complaints and told him to keep grinding the coffee beans. Midoriya's arms ached after 4 hours of grinding. He felt like he might cry. Every day Aizawa came up with strange tasks that somehow doubled as training. Things only intensified after Midoriya revealed his quirk. They immediately began focus training and Midoriya would often collapse from exhaustion if he was lucky. Despite the punishing routine, 5 months of training had left Midoriya stronger and his quirk noticeably improved. After some time, Midoriya called out to Hobo, asking if he could nap after finishing his chores. Hobo waved him off and told him to clean the cat litter to train his sense of smell. Midoriya groaned but complied. The house had become like a second home to him. He spent most days there training or hanging out with whoever was around. Hobo and the others felt like family in a way he would not say aloud. He changed the litter, holding his breath when necessary and taking quick gasps to breathe. When he finished and disposed of the litter, he told Hobo he was done. Hobo glanced up briefly before returning to his magazine and said goodbye. Midoriya left and walked home. From Bakuga's perspective, the green-haired boy had been missing for months and Bakugu resented not knowing where he and his aunt had gone. Bakugu had tried contacting Inko, but the numbers seemed disconnected. Annoyed, he decided to get coffee and clear his head. The summer heat pressed down, but his quirk worked better in the warmth. He reached a small cafe, where the coffee was excellent, and opened the door. He was surprised to see Midoriya at the counter. Midoriya turned when he heard his old nickname. He greeted Bakugo with a tentative hello. Bakugo demanded to know where he had been for half a year and why he had not been told about any move. Midoriya shrugged and admitted he did not have a clear answer, saying he had gotten bored. When Bakugo pressed what Midoriya had been bored of, Midoriya offered a non-committal reply and moved to leave with his coffee. Bakugo grabbed Midoriya's wrist and demanded to know why neither he nor Midoriya had been informed about the move. The atmosphere changed instantly. Midoriya's expression went cold and his eyes took on a hollow, controlled intensity. Bakugo felt the sudden shift and released Midoriya's wrist, unsettled by the unfamiliar fear in Midoriya's stare. Midoriya accused Bakugo of being blind to what had happened because of his ego, and then revealed that Auntie Inko had died 4 years ago and that Bakugo had seemed not to know or care. Midoriya left before Bakugo could respond, leaving Bakugo standing in stunned silence. Midoriya held himself together until he reached home. The encounter with Bakugo had shaken him deeply. He unlocked the door with trembling hands and shut it behind him. Tears leaked down his cheeks as he tried to process the sudden surge of old grief and anger. He retreated to the bathroom to be alone and to calm himself. After some time alone, he changed and sat quietly, staring at his arm as memories and regrets cycled through his mind. He berated himself softly for losing control of his emotions, then switched off the lights and went to bed, exhausted and still unsettled by the afternoon. Midoriya's POV. The entrance exams were a week away and Midoriya felt ready. He greeted Hisashi with a casual hello, and Hisashi replied that he was making food again that night and bet 530 yen on who could guess what it was. Midoriya joked that he would have fuller pockets, teasing Hisashi about previous bets. Aizawa offered his own guess. Hisashi rolled his eyes and declared that it was a quiche pie, wiping away a mock tear. Midoriya held out his hand to Aizawa for payment when Aizawa lost the bet, then snickered as he ate the slimy-looking dish. Hisashi's cooking was a little off-putting on the surface but usually tasted fine. After dinner they watched a movie. Hisashi leaned close to Aizawa, and although Aizawa initially resisted, he eventually relaxed and rested against Hisashi. Midoriya found their affectionate, low-key moment awkward and felt a little queasy at the display of closeness. When the movie ended, Midoriya tried to leave but Hisashi suggested he stay for the rest of the week to get extra training. Midoriya accidentally called them dads, realized what he had said, and flushed with embarrassment before bolting to his room. He changed into a gray hoodie and buried his face in his pillow, berating himself for the slip-up and wondering why he had said it. Aizawa's POV. Aizawa's eyes widened when he heard Midoriya call them dads. He watched the boy run down the hallway and saw Hisashi glow with excitement, practically tearing up at the word. Hisashi gushed about how happy he was, while Aizawa tried to be calmer, worrying that Midoriya would overthink the situation. They agreed to act normal and went to bed. The next morning, Midoriya woke to sunlight and immediately remembered the previous night. Panic rose in him and he felt overwhelmed, fearing they would hate him or kick him out. He had a private breakdown, then forced himself to compose and calm down before leaving his room. As he opened his door, the familiar smell of coffee and bacon greeted him. He paused, unsure whether to hide for the day or face everyone, then decided to pull himself together and head to the kitchen. Aizawa and Hisashi noticed Midoriya and greeted him normally. Hisashi told him that they would train in an hour and that he should be ready. Midoriya was confused by how everyone was acting as if nothing had happened but tried to match their calm. He finished eating and, with only a few minutes left, changed into his usual training clothes, a black turtleneck and sweatpants. Quietly, he went out to the backyard to train. A hand settled on his shoulder and Aizawa announced that they would be training at Takoba Beach, and that Midoriya would be cleaning it up. Aizawa warned him that he had the day and the next to finish and joked about consequences if he failed. Midoriya protested at the scale of the task and wondered how he would manage without using his fire-like quirk. Aizawa smirked and urged him to find a way, saying they had limited time. Midoriya arrived at the beach and stared in horror at the huge pile of trash. Aizawa watched from nearby with a teasing expression. Frustrated, Midoriya started by pulling pieces toward him using his shadows, struggling at first to find an efficient method. Aizawa's POV. Aizawa lingered to watch how Midoriya would handle the problem. He expected Midoriya to think his way through things, but the boy was initially flustered and making little progress. Impatient, Aizawa nudged him and tested him with intermittent uses of his quirk to push Midoriya a little harder. After a while he left, hoping Midoriya would figure it out and grinning at the thought of not having to deal with unpleasant chores. Midoriya's POV. Left to his own devices, Midoriya wrestled with the problem. As evening fell and his quirk strengthened in the dark, an idea came to him. He created a dark enclosure to amplify his ability, and suddenly his power became far more efficient. He smiled as he organized the trash into 6 manageable piles and loaded them into a wheelbarrow. It took him 7 trips, but by the time his phone read 6:09 p.m., the beach was clean and he felt a quiet pride in what he had accomplished. Midoriya ran home using his quirk to boost him. He saw the lights on in the house and thought that dinner should be soon. Smiling, he opened the door and the sour smell of cooking hit him immediately. Hisashi announced that Midoriya was home. Aizawa asked if he had given up. Midoriya insisted that he had finished the task already and added that he would shower because he smelled. Hisashi told him that dinner would be ready in 20 minutes. Midoriya, eager to earn more money from the bet, declared that the loser would have to cook for the next week so everyone could better appreciate his culinary masterpieces. Hisashi and Aizawa reacted with surprise. Midoriya worried that he could not afford to lose, remembering past kitchen disasters, and Aizawa and he held a long, tense staring contest before Hisashi shooed him away to shower. At the dinner table, the tension between Midoriya and Aizawa remained heavy. Hisashi placed the food down and Midoriya glanced at it, thinking it looked like a gray glob with green beans. Midoriya guessed that it was green bean stew. Aizawa suggested it was a green bean casserole, and Hisashi agreed that it was a casserole, wishing Midoriya luck. Midoriya silently hoped nobody would have to suffer through his cooking for the next week, and then ate, savoring what he thought might be the last decent meal before the bet's consequences. Later, as he prepared for bed, Midoriya said goodnight to Hobo and Hisashi. Hisashi told him that he could call them dad if he wanted, which made Midoriya blush and stammer a nervous goodnight. Pa wished him good night by using his name, and Aizawa added a nickname. Midoriya went to bed feeling finally content. The night before the UA exam was restless for Midoriya. He couldn't sleep, and his worries about whether he would make it into the hero course crowded his thoughts until he finally drifted off. In the morning, someone called for Midoriya to wake up. Bakugo, referred to as Kaken, threw a cat toward him as a loud, abrasive wake-up method. The little black and white cat hissed and nipped his arm before jumping away. Kaken warned him that he had more cats ready if he did not respond. Midoriya complained that such a dramatic wake-up was unkind. Kaken told him bluntly to get up and hurry because they were leaving in 30 minutes. Midoriya told Kaken that Pa would wake him when it was time. Realizing he'd spoken without thinking, he panicked at the mistake and quickly said his goodbyes before hurrying out. He dressed in a gray hoodie and black sweatpants and went to the kitchen, where Pa, after some coaxing and a less-than-stellar attempt in the past, had returned to cooking duty. Pa greeted him with a plate of pancakes, and Midoriya thanked him. Pa reminded him that he needed all his energy for the exam and gave him an encouraging thumbs up. Midoriya ate quickly. He walked to the car with Hobo and Pa. Hobo asked if he was ready, and Midoriya answered that he was. The car dropped him at UA, and since he was the first to arrive, he wandered into the auditorium to look around and then sat in the back when it began to fill. While Pa explained the point system for the exam, a boy stood up and criticized the printed materials, arguing loudly that the school should be ashamed of errors and that examinees were there to be molded into exemplary heroes. He also complained about Midoriya's muttering, calling it distracting. Midoriya signaled to Pa that he would handle it and then told the boy to be quiet in a firmer tone. The boy, taken aback, apologized to Pa and sat down. Pa smirked at Midoriya, and Midoriya returned the grin before dozing off. A hand shook him awake. It was Kaken, who brusquely reminded everyone that they were heading to the exam site. Midoriya, still sleepy, muttered that Pa would wake him later. Realizing his slip, he jumped up, scratched his neck awkwardly, and made a quick exit so Kaken could not tease him further. He boarded his assigned bus and fell asleep again. The bus came to a sudden stop and Midoriya's head bumped the seat in front of him. He muttered under his breath at the discomfort. A robot attendee approached and scolded him for falling asleep and causing trouble for others, advising better scheduling next time. Midoriya snickered and asked if the complaint was about Kaken. He laughed a little louder than intended and drew looks from the other students. Suddenly an alarm sounded and Pa gave the signal for the exams to begin. Everyone paused for a moment in surprise before rushing to take their places. Midoriya yawned and then sprinted off to join the action. The green-haired boy was given a 30-second head start before he jumped into the exam. Aizawa and Hisashi watched him from the recording room, and many of the teachers were stunned by the sight of Aizawa smiling at the screen. All Might, the new teacher, was puzzled by the commotion but kept his eye on a certain boy with curly green hair who looked familiar. He watched with awe as the boy dismantled robots with ease. All Might thought the boy was truly powerful and decided he should become his successor. Midoriya felt his aura surge the moment he stepped into the arena. Everyone momentarily froze at the sudden change in pressure before returning to their tasks, uncertain where it had come from. Midoriya smiled inwardly at the disbelief he sensed from others and used his shadows to lift himself for a better view of the arena. When he locked onto a three-pointer robot, he sprinted with astonishing speed, delivered a decisive strike that disabled it, and moved on to the next target. One by one, units fell under his controlled onslaught until he had neutralized 63 robots. He smiled with a dark satisfaction and went to find another opponent. A high, urgent scream rang through the arena. Midoriya snapped his head toward the sound and saw a girl trapped beneath rubble. He sighed at the thought that the trapped girl had been caught by a low-value robot but went to help her anyway. He ran to the debris and boosted himself with his quirk until he was level with the wreckage. He taunted the machine and then released a swirl of shadows that overloaded its systems, leaving it immobile. He followed with a precise kick that sent it skidding across the arena in a shower of sparks. He landed gracefully and, while he was lifting the unconscious girl, the timer expired. Midoriya worried briefly about his point total, then carried the girl toward the entrance to look for medical assistance. As he searched, he felt a sharp sting in his leg and cursed under his breath. An old woman approached and indicated that he needed to sit to avoid worsening a sprain. Midoriya looked down to see a swollen ankle and recognized the woman as the one who had helped him earlier. He awkwardly set the girl down and attempted to leave, but a can the girl had held rolled beneath his feet and knocked him over. He sat on the ground, stunned and wondering when that had happened. The old woman urged him to rest his ankle and moved closer to tend to it. Midoriya sighed and shifted toward her, still sore from the fall, and allowed her to work. The faculty emerged from the recording room, all of them captivated by the boy with green hair. Aizawa and Hisashi stepped out with smug expressions, quietly proud of their roles in shaping him. Hisashi teased that he was so proud he should make the boy's favorite dinner, and Aizawa responded with mock annoyance that hinted at affection rather than irritation. Their banter was warm and easy between longtime colleagues. All Might approach them with a broad grin, unaware of the mixed reactions he drew. Aizawa and Hisashi tried to continue down the hallway to avoid him, but All Might intercepted them with bright determination. Aizawa brusquely asked what he wanted, and All Might, momentarily puzzled by their coldness, explained that he had something important to tell the green-haired boy and asked if they knew who he was. Hisashi ducked past with a scoff, and Aizawa reminded All Might that he had met the boy before twice. In fact, before following Hisashi. All Might scratched his head, baffled by the notion that he might already have met someone so selfless and powerful. Convinced he must make this boy his successor, All Might tightened his fist and set off in search of the young hero who might despise him most of all. Chapter End. Aizawa's POV. My stomach churned after leaving the building. My fists were balled so tight that my knuckles were white. Hisashi was no better. The normally hyper and cheerful man had been replaced by someone bristling with anger, ready to take on anyone who came near. I knew I had a few choice words for Nizu about appointing All Might as a teacher. Hisashi and I were walking to retrieve Izuku when he stopped. I looked over his shoulder to see All Might standing over my problem child, appearing to tremble as if laughing. The closer we got, the heavier the air felt. Then we realized All Might wasn't laughing. He was trembling from fear of the problem child. Hisashi and I hid behind a corner to listen. Midoriya's POV. I woke from a short nap and heard footsteps around the corner, assuming it was my dad's. I moved toward the doorway but stopped when I saw All Might sitting there. I scoffed at the idea that he didn't recognize me and thought bitterly that the moments when he had mattered to me must have meant nothing to him. All Might stood and approached. He reached as if to place a hand on my shoulder, and I quickly avoided the touch, glaring until he stilled. I snorted at the number 1 hero's strained smile. All Might praised my actions in the rescue and then asked my name in a friendly, faltering way. I felt my anger rise. The temperature in the room seemed to spike and All Might froze, beginning to shake. I mentally mocked him for forgetting me and questioned what he wanted. All Might stumbled over an answer, congratulating me on my exam and calling my rescue heroic. I reacted with a derisive laugh and a sarcastic clap. Then I asked what he wanted. All Might's thoughts. All Might felt the boy's presence as something shockingly powerful, an aura that reminded him of All for One and unsettled him. He considered whether to reveal more about himself, but the boy's hostility scared him. He decided, with a nervous smile, to watch the boy for 3 months and then decide if he was worthy. He briefly wondered if he had met the boy before but couldn't place it. When the boy waved a hand in his face and demanded an answer, All Might congratulated him on his performance and then accepted the boy's sarcastic nickname before the boy walked off. Third-person scene. Aizawa and Hisashi were still pressed against the wall, struggling not to laugh at All Might's awkwardness. Hisashi tried to explain through his amusement that they had been spying on All Might, not the boy. Midoriya revealed himself and asked whether they had been spying on him, startling the 2 pro-heroes. Midoriya then strolled toward the parking lot where the buses were parked. Soon after, Hisashi and Aizawa arrived at the parking lot. Aizawa shepherded everyone into the car and drove them home. Time skip. Midoriya's POV. When the car pulled up at my apartment, I offered a quick goodbye and went inside to the same gloomy apartment I always returned to. During the ride I had learned that All Might would be teaching at UA, and my dad had some blunt opinions about it. Although I had put on a composed front when speaking with All Might, I was actually unraveling. Every exchange chipped away at the fragile control I had left. By the end of the drive I felt myself beginning to break. Frustrated, I struck the wall hard, creating a large hole in the drywall. I cursed and looked at my aching hand, feeling the weight of everything crashing down. Alone and overwhelmed, he spiraled for a time and eventually lost consciousness. When he came to, a white light flooded his senses. The surroundings were a blank white void. A figure descended toward him and, when it reached the ground, pulled him into a warm, comforting hug. He felt wetness on his shoulders and pushed the person back to see his mother crying. He took her face in his hands and wiped away her tears. Izuku asked his mother what was wrong. She apologized for having to leave him alone. He protested weakly that he had not truly left her and that he would have been able to help. Tears tracked down his face as he pulled his mother into a hug. He told her it was all right, that he had his father's now and that they had helped him a great deal. He was slowly getting better. His mother smiled and held his face in her small hands, looking straight into his eyes as she told him how much she loved him and how strong he was. She urged him to find something, anything, to keep him grounded. They pressed foreheads together and closed their eyes. She told him she did not have much time left, said goodbye, and expressed her love one last time before she slipped away. When Izuku opened his teary eyes, a sharp ache ran through his head as he sat up and took stock of the room. There was a sticky substance on his arm. He realized with a sinking feeling that he had hurt himself again. Frustration and guilt overwhelmed him as he scolded himself for the choices he had made and for not going with his father's. He inspected the marks, then rose to clean the stains on the carpet and tend to his wounds as best he could. A glance at the clock told him it was 4:39. He still had time to make it to dinner. He scrubbed at the floor vigorously until he was satisfied, put away the cleaning supplies, and changed into a black hoodie and sweatpants. The jog to the house was peaceful. The wind cooled his sweating face as he ran. When the house came into view, he slowed and approached on foot. He knocked, and Dad answered the door with a teasing greeting, calling him problem child and asking where he had been all day. Izuku swallowed and lied that he had been sleeping. Seeing the pleading look in his eyes, Dad did not press further and let him in. The warm smell of katsudon greeted him in the doorway, and for the first time in a while he felt a bright lift in his chest. He bent down and petted the swarm of cats that padded up to him. There were 12 cats in total, with one more seeming to join the house every month. When he had first arrived there had been only 3 Yoko, Yuri, and Fuku, all Siamese from the same litter. Dad later rescued 2 tabbies named Nami and Turd Nugget. The next 7 had been adopted from various shelters, 4 black cats named Suki, Eiji, Neen, and Aizawa Jr., the fluffy gray twins Tsuki and Jeff who were very antisocial, and a sandy-colored cat named Aslan. Izuku thought there were too many, but Dad argued that one could never have too many cats. He rolled his eyes at the memory and sat down at the table. Pa set the food down and took his seat. The meal looked especially good that day, and Izuku dug in, hurriedly eating the pork and rice. He was so engrossed in the food that he barely noticed Pa and Dad watching him with nervous expressions. Pa cleared his throat and produced a paper from behind his back, sliding it across the table. Izuku choked on his food when he read the contents. Tears brimmed in his eyes. He stared at the document in disbelief. Pa crouched beside him, wiped his tears, and told him that since he had come to the house it had been like a light had entered their lives. Pa asked if Izuku wanted to be adopted by them. Overwhelmed and unable to trust his words, Izuku nodded vigorously. Dad and Pa stood and hugged him, telling him they loved him and calling him problem child with fondness. He signed the adoption papers and handed them to Pa, feeling happier than he had in a long time. 1 week later, Izuku received his acceptance letter from UA but did not open it. He already knew he had been accepted because Pa and Dad had told him, and he felt awkward about seeing All Might's hologram in the letter. For the week leading up to the first day of school, he devoted all his time to training. It was tiring, but he believed it would pay off. On the first day of school, he hurried into his uniform after Dad woke him late. The family had decided to keep his relationship with his father's private at school, so he left on foot while his father's rode in the air-conditioned car. He ran to make use of the exercise and to avoid being late. The horizon was painted with pinks, oranges, and yellows, and the sight lifted his spirits as he picked up his pace. When the gates of UA came into view, he took a deep breath and stepped into the hero school he had dreamed about since childhood. He was assigned to Class 1A, with Dad as the homeroom teacher. Izuku snickered to himself and suspected Dad would spend much of the time napping. The classroom erupted in screeching moments after he took a front seat. A robot boy reprimanded a student for putting his legs on the desk and lectured about respect for fellow students and the school. The scene was almost comical, especially because the reprimand was directed at Bakugo Katsuki, who seemed more stunned than angry. No one had ever yelled at the robot boy like that before, and it was probably upsetting him. I had saved him from certain danger, so I smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder, mentioning that we had met at the entrance exam. Tenya Ida adjusted his glasses, introduced himself as Tenya Ida, and offered his hand. I tried to ignore the heat radiating from Katsuki Bakugo, but it became harder with every passing second. I introduced myself as Izuku Aizawa, and noted that, despite his parents' wishes to keep the relationship quiet, I had taken my father's last name. Tenya apologized for his earlier behavior and bowed politely, admitting that my selfless actions at the exam had shown he had been wrong to judge me. He excused himself to finish speaking with the delinquent nearby, and I warned him not to provoke Bakugo, explaining that Bakugo was already furious and that he might come away with a broken nose if he pushed things. Tenya brightened at the advice and thanked me. I tried not to notice Bakugo's glare as I sat in the back and prepared to take a nap. Homeroom was lively as more students trickled in. Shoto Todoroki sat apart from the chatter at the back next to me. Only I and Todoroki seemed to notice the student who had sneaked into the room. I stifled a snicker when most of the class jumped. Aizawa announced that he was Aizawa, their homeroom teacher, and told them to change into gym clothes for a quirk test. He then climbed back into his bag and went to sleep. I was the first to stand. As I left, the rest of the class followed. We changed in our respective locker rooms. I had requested and been given a long-sleeved shirt, which drew puzzled looks because it was warm outside, but I did not care. Aizawa stood near a board displaying the top exam scores. The scoreboard showed my name at the top, Izuku Aizawa, with a total of 186 points, 126 villain points and 60 rescue points. The next names were Katsuki Bakugu with 77 total, Eijiro Kirishima with 74, Ochako Uraraka with 73, and Tenya Ida with. Everyone turned to look when they saw the gap between my score and Bakugu's. According to my father, I had broken UA's record by 30 points. Bakugu strode over and grabbed my shirt by the collar, shouting about my name change and suddenly having a quirk. I told him I had always had my quirk, flicked his hand away, and moved to stand beside Todoroki. I felt unexpectedly safe next to him. I noticed how striking he was and felt my attention catch on him. Aizawa cleared his throat and called me forward. He reminded us that the physical ability tests from middle school would be repeated, but this time we could use our quirks. He asked what my ball throw had been in middle school. Struggling to remember, I guessed 30 meters. Everyone was surprised that the top test scorer had performed so poorly in middle school. Aizawa asked me to try again with my quirk. When I went to throw the ball, my quirk seemed to falter, but I threw it anyway. I asked Aizawa why my quirk had been erased, and he replied that he had simply felt like doing it. He then revealed that my score without a quirk had been 100 meters and encouraged me to try again. Gathering shadows and using them to propel the ball forward, I made a throw that registered at 1,000 meters. Aizawa announced that everyone would take the test and warned that the person who placed last would be expelled. The next event was a 50-meter dash, which I completed in 3 seconds and placed second behind Ida. Most of the students did well, though a few quirks puzzled me, like the student who could turn invisible and the small purple student who seemed prone to exhaustion. The grip strength test followed, and I recorded a force of 650 kilograms, putting me in first. I kept placing first or second in the long jump and the remaining tests, which passed quickly. The class grew uneasy, wondering who might finish last and whether Aizawa's expulsion threat was serious or just a way to stress us. During a lull, the student with heterochromatic eyes noticed I had been muttering and remarked that it was an old habit. The reaction from Bakugu to my earlier awkwardness was loud and scathing in his mind, but I shrugged it off and tried to focus on the next challenge. Way to go with the awesome speaking skills, the teacher joked, and then the teacher announced the test results. Izuku Aizawa had come in first, Momo Yaoyorozu second, Shoto Todoroki third, Katsuki Bakugu fourth, Tenya Ida fifth, and Minoru Mineta 20th. Mineta began to wail, and the narrator noted that within the first hour he had already proven himself unpleasant. The teacher dismissed the class to the classroom and announced that Mineta was expelled. Izuku and his father exchanged a smirk before Izuku headed off to change. On the walk home, Izuku thought about the red and white-haired boy and smiled to himself, wondering if the attraction meant anything definitive about his identity. He reflected that he had never paid much attention to these kinds of feelings before, and that not knowing right away did not mean anything final. When he arrived home, his father's car was already in the driveway. His father greeted him by teasingly calling him problem child without looking up from his book, while his other father rushed to the door and hugged him. The other father asked how school had been, and Izuku tried to answer but found his words muffled by the hug. When he pulled away, he giggled and said that school had been good. His father asked him to tell them all about it at dinner, especially if there was anyone he found cute, which brought Izuku's thoughts back to Todoroki. Izuku went to his computer and searched for information about attraction, running through queries about whether finding a boy cute meant he was gay. After getting no satisfying answers, he sighed and went to dinner when his father's called him. The meal was recognizable curry that his father had made. When his fathers looked at him curiously, Izuku, feeling embarrassed, asked how they had known they were gay. His other father explained that he had known at 16 because of a boy in his class who had been mean at first but later became his husband. He married him the year after graduation. Izuku's first father admitted that he couldn't remember exactly when he knew, but that at some point Hisashi had become his husband. They reassured Izuku that he did not have to have everything figured out right now and that he had his whole life to learn what he felt and whom he wanted to like. Izuku felt some relief and thanked his father. The rest of dinner was spent sharing how everyone's day had gone. Too tired to stay up, Izuku went to bed. Later, in homeroom, Izuku noticed Todoroki sitting alone. Izuku approached and introduced himself as Izuku Aizawa, holding out his hand. Todoroki acknowledged the introduction, and Izuku sat down. Izuku asked Todoroki for his first name and learned it was Shoto. Izuku then complimented Todoroki's scar, and Todoroki blushed deeply. When Todoroki touched his eye, Izuku worried he had offended him and apologized for any unintended offense. Todoroki gave a small smile and thanked him, then returned a compliment by saying that Izuku's freckles were cute. Izuku blushed in turn. After class, Izuku called Todoroki by the nickname he had made up, To-do, and asked if they could walk home together. Todoroki agreed, appearing outwardly indifferent but inwardly curious about how someone could be so cheerful. They walked through the streets, with Izuku pointing out his favorite cafe and other small landmarks. Every now and then Todoroki's expression softened into a brief smile before becoming reserved again. At Izuku's house, Izuku waved goodbye and went inside. His other father asked if the boy had been the one Izuku had been crushing over, and when Izuku admitted that he had, the father asked Izuku to tell him everything about Todoroki, including what he liked about him. Pa kept asking what he was like as the narrator stood awkwardly. It promised to be a long night. Todoroki's POV. After dropping Aizawa off at his house, Todoroki ran home as fast as he could. He could not afford to be late. If he was, father would punish him. He arrived with burning lungs and opened the door to find his father furious. Father demanded to know where Todoroki had been. Todoroki explained that he had walked a friend home. In response, father struck him across the face, then kicked him in the stomach and hauled him to the training room. Father ordered extra training, no dinner, and insisted that Todoroki tell his new friend that friends were unnecessary and a waste of time. Todoroki felt his knees go weak but swallowed his protest. He agreed, terrified of what would happen if he disobeyed. He left as soon as he could, wanting to escape the guilt of what he had been forced to say. Izuku's POV. Izuku woke bright and early, actually looking forward to school for the first time in years. He cleaned his eyes, found his uniform, and changed. He greeted his father with a playful gesture, and his father offered breakfast. Izuku accepted, grabbed the food, and left, already thinking about spending extra time at school with Todoroki. He ran as fast as he could, briefly using his quirk to give himself a boost. The school grew larger as he approached, and he swiped his card and darted into the classroom. Only Todoroki and Ida were there. Ida looked like he was about to scold him for running in the halls, but Izuku waved him off. Todoroki seemed wrong in a way Izuku couldn't ignore. There was something in his eyes, a buried hurt and frustration. Izuku noticed bruises and burn marks on Todoroki's face, neck, and hands. Todoroki asked to speak with Izuku alone and suggested going into the hallway. Izuku felt a small panic but smiled and said he would follow. They walked until Todoroki stopped against the wall behind the bathrooms. Todoroki turned and stared at him, his voice slightly shaking as he read words he had been forced to use. Todoroki declared that he did not want friends, that he did not want to be involved with someone weak like Izuku, that friends were a waste of time, and that Izuku should not speak to him again. He walked away with his shoulder brushing past Izuku, leaving Izuku standing in shock as tears fell. Todoroki's POV. Todoroki watched Izuku's bright smile crumple into pain as he spoke the lines his father had written for him. He hated what he had to do, but fear of the consequences left him no choice. He fled before he could see the full impact of his words. Izuku's POV. The bell had rung more than 30 minutes earlier, but Izuku remained crouched and crying. He told himself he was worthless and questioned why he had tried at all. He clawed at his wrists, aggravating old scars and causing sharp pain. Todoroki's harsh words echoed in his head over and over. Suddenly hands stopped his motion. He looked up through blurred tears and saw Bakugu standing over him, alarm and anger on his face. Bakugu grabbed Izuku's hands to stop him, and when Izuku recognized who it was, he bolted away in fear. Bakugu's POV. It was first PRD, and Aizawa had ordered Bakugu and Ida to look for Izuku. Bakugu had been searching for 10 minutes when he heard muffled sobbing by the bathrooms and found Izuku. He watched in shock as Izuku harmed himself. It terrified him to see someone he had known since childhood in that state. Bakugu seized Izuku's hands, but Izuku panicked and ran, leaving Bakugu to pull out his phone and send a message. Bakugu texted Ida that he had found Izuku and that Aizawa should be alerted, saying where he was by the bathrooms. Ida replied asking if Izuku had run away from Bakugu, and Bakugu urged him to get Aizawa quickly. Ida acknowledged the message. Bakugu clicked his tongue and put his phone away. He sighed and thought back to how bad Izuku's anxiety had been as a child, wondering how he could help now. Izuku berated himself for letting his pride get in the way of noticing that someone else was in distress. Teacher Aizawa's panting interrupted his thoughts and Aizawa asked where the injured student was. Izuku pointed down the hallway and watched as Aizawa's face drained of color at the sight of a trail of blood. Aizawa began to sprint while sending a quick message on his phone. Izuku ran after him but could not see who he was texting. The trail of blood thinned, which was both a relief and a concern. They needed to find the student quickly before he did anything rash. The trail led up the stairs to the roof. Aizawa muttered that it could not be happening again, then urged haste and said Mike would be arriving as well. They rushed onto the rooftop together. Izuku watched Kaken and his other guardians sprint up the stairs. He felt guilty for misleading them earlier. He had wanted to be alone. He kept his injured arm close and staggered out of the school gate. He went to the childhood park and tried to find comfort in the memories he and Kaken had once shared. A few parents cast him worried, judgmental looks because of the stain on his sleeve, but no one approached. He thought sadly that his mother would not have ignored someone in trouble, and he let the thought make him tear up before he slid behind a large tree to hide and fell into an exhausted sleep. Later, the sound of children playing woke him. He smiled briefly, then froze when he looked at his arm and realized it still needed attention. He pulled his sleeve down to hide it, checked his watch, and found it was just afternoon. Panic spiked. He ran back toward you, anxious about how frantic his guardians would be. Inside the school things seemed normal, and Izuku tried to ignore the students who stared at him. He walked into classroom 1A and noticed Todoroki Shoto watching him with a look that Izuku could not easily read. At first Izuku interpreted it as pity, and that stung. He blinked away tears and hurried to the teacher's lounge, where Aizawa and Mike were already waiting. When he entered the lounge, everyone looked up. Mike and Aizawa moved quickly to wrap him in a protective embrace. Mike reassured him that he did not need to explain right away and that they understood. Bakugu stood, grumbled that he had been worried for nothing, and walked out. Mike explained to Bakugu that the injured student had been helping look for Izuku and that Izuku's blood led up to the roof, which left Bakugu momentarily quiet. After a short time, Aizawa and Mike reluctantly released Izuku but stayed close, afraid he might bolt again. Aizawa urged him to change out of the stained shirt, and Izuku complied, slipping on a clean uniform from the spare supply. Aizawa smiled and reminded him that class would start soon and that they would talk about everything at home. Izuku nodded and followed Aizawa to the classroom. When the bell rang, students filed into the room and Izuku felt their gazes on him once more. A pink-haired classmate approached his desk to check on him and ask where he had been. She was quickly shooed away by Bakugu, who had returned to defend him. Izuku felt a moment of relief at Bakugu's intervention. During class, Izuku's thoughts kept drifting to Todoroki. Now that he had calmed, Izuku noticed small things he had missed earlier. Faint bruising and an odd expression on Todoroki's face. He interpreted those signs as possible regret rather than contempt and decided it would be best to give Todoroki some space for now. He focused on Aizawa's lecture about Quirk's safety for the rest of the PRD. When the final bell rang, Aizawa asked Izuku to stay behind. The classroom emptied, leaving only the soft rustle of papers as Aizawa continued his grading. Todoroki lingered briefly, wearing a pained expression, then left without a final exchange. Izuku considered waving but stopped himself and kept his head down. Moments later, Mike came in, ruffled Izuku's hair, and called for everyone to get ready to go. The drive home was tense and quiet, the atmosphere thick with unspoken concern. At the house, Izuku tried to slip away before the talk could begin, but Aizawa caught him by his scarf and told him firmly that there would be no escaping the conversation this time. Izuku sighed and accepted it. They all settled on the couch together to face whatever needed to be addressed. I didn't know if I was supposed to start, so I just sat there trying to blend into the couch. Pa asked what had happened that morning. I swallowed, took a deep breath, and said that Todoroki had wanted to talk to me earlier, had been acting strange, and had said friends were a waste of time. I left out calling him a weak freak because I knew they would have flipped out. Pa sat closer and hugged me. Pa asked if I was ready to tell them about the blood situation, and said that if I wasn't it was okay, I could come to them when I was ready, but I would definitely be going to a therapist. I nodded slowly and moved away from Pa so I could roll my sleeves up. A couple of tears slid down my face silently. Pa and Dad gasped when they saw the scars across my skin. Dad asked why I hadn't told them. I shrugged, not knowing what to say. Pa tackled me into a bear hug and told me to tell them next time so they could help. I nodded and agreed. They told me they loved me and called me problem child. I told them I loved them too. That night, to take my mind off the Todoroki situation, we ate katsudon, watched movies, and Pa even gave us pedicures. I planned to get to the bottom of whatever was happening with Todoroki the next day, if anything was actually happening at all. Izuku's POV. Over the next month, I tried talking to Todoroki, but was only met with short answers or, worse, complete silence. It made me feel awful, but that nagging feeling never left me. Something was up with him, and hearing Dad talk about his father only intensified the worry. Nizu kept a close eye on Todoroki's well-being, but there was little evidence that he was in immediate danger. I sighed and sat on the couch, chewing my nails, a new habit I had picked up. I tried to tell myself I might be overthinking it, but the worry persisted. It was a Sunday, which meant no school. Pa greeted me good morning. I only responded with a grunt, too caught up in my feelings to string together full sentences. Pa asked if I had taken my medication yet. I met Pa's eyes and said no, I would do it right away. After the big breakdown, I had been supposed to go to a therapist. With a lot of convincing and some deception, I had managed to stop attending regular sessions, but I still had to take medication for depression and anxiety. I wasn't thrilled and ended up spitting the pills out later. I didn't see why I had to change, I felt fine. I put the pills under my tongue, grabbed a croissant, and pretended to swallow them while talking with Pa. Later in the bathroom I spit the pills out and changed into workout clothes to train. First I went for a jog. Running always felt freeing. The wind on my face and the burn in my lungs meant something was moving inside me, and I liked that. Leaves swirled past me, falling to join the carpet of brown on the ground. The city I lived in was small compared to some, but to me it was huge. Buildings lined each street, each with a different shop inside. I liked to roam and look in windows. Once I found a shop selling strange candy shaped like insects. The idea made me GG, but I found it oddly interesting. When I finished jogging I went to the training room and meditated while waiting for Dad so we could spar. I sat and tried to calm my breathing. Every inhale made my lungs ache, but I liked the dull pain because it meant I was alive. Once I found a rhythm, I slipped into the zone and shut out the world. That was exactly the moment Dad chose to spring an attack. He told me I should always be prepared for an attack. I complained that it hurt, and he teased me for being a baby before asking if I was ready to train. I stuck my tongue out and said yes. We both charged and began to spar. After several hours, Pa forced us to stop. We hadn't realized how long we'd been at it. Laughing, we made our way to a table laden with sandwiches. I grabbed a turkey sandwich and ate it in seconds before grabbing another. After eating I went to the library and spent the rest of the day reading before heading home for dinner. I said goodnight to Dad and Pa, and they replied in kind. I slipped into my room and hid under the covers. I didn't want to go to school the next day, but I couldn't avoid it. I had a feeling like something was going to happen, and I needed to be there. Todoroki's POV. I arrived at school early again, mostly because I wanted to get away from my father. Lately, he had been escalating the severity of his so-called training and was increasingly harsh. Aizawa had finally given up on trying to reach me, which I expected. It was probably better that he stayed out of whatever I was dealing with. Still, The ache in my chest didn't go away when he stopped speaking to me. I sighed, left the classroom, and picked up some cold noodles from the cafeteria for breakfast since I hadn't had time to eat at home. After finishing, I threw the trash away and walked back into the classroom. My heart fluttered when I saw his smile. A faint blush warmed his face, but he forced it down and sat at his desk beside Aizawa. The day he had said those vicious things to him still churned in Izuku's stomach. He had wanted to throw up and cry, and more than anything he had wanted to comfort Aizawa. He also knew that if father found out he would be beaten until he could not walk and Aizawa would be in danger. He vowed that when father was gone he would dance over his grave. Izuku sighed and looked out the window, trying to shut Aizawa's voice from his mind. Izuku's POV. According to his father, today was the first day All Might would teach their class. Izuku scowled at the thought of the man. He did not expect to last an entire lesson without wanting to lash out. He hoped someone had been thinking of All Might today. Time passed until it was finally time for hero training. Izuku changed quickly in the locker room and wrapped bandages around his arms. His father had started teaching him how to use them as capture tools. He admitted to himself that he was still clumsy with it, but he was improving. At the training site he joined the few who had arrived already. In the distance he heard Uraraka complaining about her costume feeling tight. He disliked how obvious she could be about her feelings toward him. He nodded once when she called him and walked over to Jairu to talk with her. Jairu, Tsu, Kaminari, Shiro, Tokoyami, Ojiro, and Kirishima were the classmates he could tolerate. Despite his efforts to ignore Uraraka, she kept trying to get his attention. Uraraka reached for his arm and hugged it. He flinched because he did not like people touching him. He gently pushed her away, and she pouted but clung to his arm again. He told Uraraka through clenched teeth that she needed to let go of his arm. Jairu stepped back slowly, noticing his rising anger. Uraraka replied with a playful tone that she found him funny, which only aggravated him further. Uraraka's perspective. Uraraka thought Izuku was attractive and she wanted his attention. She misread his discomfort as embarrassment and kept trying to get closer to him. She reached to feel the bandages on his arm and wondered what they were for. The moment was awkward for both of them. Izuku's POV. When Uraraka started touching his bandages, Izuku lost his restraint. A ripple of force radiated from him, carrying a cold hush that made the students around them pause in alarm, including his father, who had never seen him so furious. He turned to find Uraraka still holding his arm. He ordered her to stop, and when she did not immediately comply, he released a controlled surge of his quirk to push her to the ground and pin her arm in a non-injurious restraint until she let go. He then walked away to calm himself, taking slow, shaky breaths. Kirishima walked up and crouched beside him, asking what had happened. Izuku explained that Uraraka had kept touching his arm despite his repeated requests for her to stop, and that he felt he had no choice. Kirishima listened and offered quiet company while Izuku cooled down. Eventually Izuku walked out to the field with Kirishima following as if nothing had happened. He could feel Uraraka and Ida's stares, but he did not care. He believed the situation was her fault, not his. Third-person perspective. Everyone nearby was astonished by the power Izuku had displayed. He had barely used his strength, only a fraction of what he might be capable of. All Might watched with increasing interest and began to think that this student might be a strong candidate as a successor, provided he could pass the character test All Might intended to set. Izuku's POV. All Might arrived and, as expected, placed Izuku in a team with Uraraka. They were matched against Bakugo and Ida. The rest of the groups went to the viewing room while Izuku and Uraraka waited for the villains to hide a practice bomb. Uraraka told Izuku that Bakugo would be going after her partner and that Izuku would only have to deal with Ida initially. She promised to help once she had engaged Bakugo. Izuku noted her sourness from earlier but accepted the plan. An announcement then counted down and signaled the start of the exercise. Izuku and Uraraka ran toward the building and prepared for Bakugo's unpredictable tactics. Training scene. Izuku and Uraraka entered the building on instinct and began searching for the bomb. The interior felt strange to them both, but they shook it off and continued. Uraraka ran off to search elsewhere, leaving Izuku alone to look for his childhood friend turned rival. A brief neutral moment passed as he pressed on, determined to find Bakugo and see what would happen next. Within seconds of running through the halls, Deku could hear Bakugo yelling and the loud booms of explosions. Deku sighed and stopped allowing Bakugo to come to him. Bakugo shouted angrily for Deku, using harsh words, but Deku ignored him. He willed the shadows in the corner to become liquid under his control and shaped them into a cloud-like platform. He stepped onto the swirling black mist and levitated upward. With a sudden diversion, Bakugo appeared directly below Deku, unaware. Deku dispersed the cloud and landed behind him silently. In a swift, non-graphic move, Deku incapacitated Bakugo and secured him. Deku then went to find Uraraka, guided by the sounds of crashing and shouting down the hallway. Deku produced his shadow cloud again and hovered above Ida and Uraraka. He noted how focused they were, then moved to restrain Ida. Ida only then realized Deku's presence and startled. Deku reached out to disable a device nearby. Uraraka moved forward in praise, but Deku avoided attention and slipped out the window. His sudden exit alarmed everyone. He landed on his feet from the high drop and began walking back toward the viewing room. The class exhaled when they saw him safe. All Might observed the scene with quiet determination and decided he needed to speak with young Aizawa after everyone else left. Deku remained behind with his arms folded as the others filed out to change. When the last person left, he stood straight and fixed All Might with a glare, demanding to know his purpose. All Might explained that he had intended to give a 3-month trial for passing on something of importance, but that Deku had already exceeded expectations. Deku tilted his head in confused anger and pressed for clarification. He realized, piece by piece, that All Might intended for Deku to inherit his power. Deku reacted with disgust and refused the offer. He accused All Might of spying on him over the past month. All Might tried to calm him, but Deku dismissed the attempt and told him to leave. A brief neutral sentence described that Deku accused All Might of watching him closely during that time. Deku made it clear he would not accept the proposal and then left the room, his expression hard and furious. For the first time, Deku's usual smile was gone. He walked through the halls toward the locker room with anger building until he needed distance. The tiled locker room was nearly empty, only Bakugo, Kirishima, and Todoroki remained. They froze when Deku entered. Deku quickly changed into his uniform, not wanting to linger. Bakugo approached but stopped when he saw how irritated Deku was. Deku's breathing was shallow as he tried to control himself. Todoroki stepped forward and put a hand on Deku's shoulder, which made Deku tense and spin around sharply. He struggled with conflicting feelings about Todoroki's touch. Kirishima awkwardly announced that they were going to leave and ushered Bakugo out, leaving Deku and Todoroki alone. Todoroki turned Deku and gently wiped away the tears trickling down his face. Deku had not noticed them until then. Todoroki's expression softened. Deku scoffed and pushed Todoroki's hand away, calling himself a waste of time. Todoroki froze for a moment, then seemed to return to his usual calm. As Deku ran out the door, Todoroki followed and grabbed his hand to stop him. Deku tried to pull free but Todoroki's grip held. Todoroki apologized quietly and then hesitated, looking down. Deku told Todoroki he didn't know what to think and asked to be left alone. Todoroki reluctantly released him, and Deku ran away. Todoroki reflected that he had risked a lot by speaking up and felt defeated as he headed to his next class. He worried about the consequences at home. Time passed. The bell rang, and Deku glanced back at Aizawa before going home. He breathed deeply and entered the house, then flinched at his father's angry call. He answered and faced his father's stern presence in the hallway. He told his father that he had spoken to him, and his father demanded to know why there was a report of the conversation. He wondered if his father had put in spies. He tried to dismiss it as nothing. His father struck him hard across the face. He held his hand to his cheek, dazed as the blow sent him to the floor. His father berated him while delivering more violent, forceful blows that left him aching and humiliated. He refused to cry. Tears would only encourage his father. When the beating stopped, his father left and ordered him to be in the training room in 5 minutes. He forced himself upright, wobbled to the dojo, and silently endured the forming bruises. He pushed through the following training in a blur of repetition, recovering as best he could while forcing himself to learn and improve. Later, after training, his father went to bed tired and asked his sister Fuyumi to cover for him. He stepped out into the night and jogged to the park, wanting to get away from the house. He let himself breathe under the starry sky. The crickets and a soft wind were the only sounds. He sat on a bench, drawing a small measure of peace. A child nearby found the swings calming. When he returned home that night, his parents were laughing at something silly that had happened at school. They told him he had made All Might lose his composure in the teacher's lounge, and he stifled a laugh at the memory. A familiar figure sat on a park bench, half hidden in the soft streetlight. Izuku recognized Todoroki and approached slowly, careful not to startle him. When Izuku drew closer, he took in the marks along Todoroki's body-reddened skin and burns that had left painful-looking welts. Todoroki turned toward him with an expression of fear and then quickly looked away. Izuku sat beside him and told him he could tell him if something was wrong. Todoroki insisted that he did not hate Izuku. Izuku did not believe him at first and suggested taking him home to clean his wounds. Todoroki pulled his hand away. Todoroki suddenly exploded with pent-up emotion, loudly insisting that he did not hate Izuku and that he had never wanted to say cruel things. His voice cracked with the force of the confession. Izuku saw him break down. Tears rolled down Todoroki's cheeks. He crouched, gently cupped Todoroki's face, and felt the unexpected warmth of tears. He wrapped Todoroki in a careful hug, mindful of the injuries, and told him that he believed him. Todoroki leaned his head on Izuku's shoulder, and they sat together in the quiet park. Izuku asked where the wounds had come from. Todoroki named his father. Alarmed, Izuku moved to examine Todoroki's face. Todoroki quickly clapped his hands over his mouth as if trying to swallow back the words. Izuku urged him to go to the police, worried that someone who had been harmed should report it. Todoroki refused, convinced that no one would believe that a respected hero could be abusive. Izuku countered by suggesting surveillance instead. He proposed that the authorities monitor his father from a distance to review his behavior, a measure that would not be obvious to the man in question. Todoroki hesitated, then slowly nodded in agreement. As they left the park, Izuku asked whether Todoroki's guardian had forced him to speak a certain way. Todoroki spat out that the man was not his father and admitted that he had pressured him into saying things. He apologized profusely for the earlier classroom incident when Izuku had been hurt and visibly shaken. Izuku reassured him and reminded him that he was still okay. That helped Todoroki straighten his shoulders and keep moving. They reached the police station and paused at the entrance while Todoroki tried to steady his nerves. Izuku squeezed his hand and led him inside. At the front desk, they told the officer that they needed to file a complaint and request private surveillance. The officer typed information into a computer, handed them forms, and directed them to the last interviewing room down the left-hand hallway. They thanked him and proceeded together. The interviewing room was spare. A table, a few chairs, and an unassuming fake plant in the corner. They sat down. Izuku handed Todoroki a form and a pen he had taken from the desk and prepared to help him tell the truth. Izuku watched Todoroki concentrate on the paper. Under different circumstances it might have looked endearing, but he pushed the feeling aside and focused on helping as much as he could. When Todoroki finished filling out the form, they rested in a comfortable silence until the sound of the door opening broke it. Both of them turned toward the noise. Izuku's eye twitched at the sight of the man, which brought memories of his mother's death, but he kept those memories under control so he could support Todoroki. Detective Tsukachi introduced himself and said he would be helping them that day. Izuku smiled and nodded in response. Izuku then told the detective that he should probably leave, since he was not the victim and did not have relevant information. Tsukachi acknowledged this, and Izuku bent down to speak quietly to Todoroki. Izuku offered Todoroki a place to stay and provided an address before leaving the room, squeezing Todoroki's hand on his way out. Todoroki did not really want to be at the station. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Detective Tsukachi sat down and examined him. The detective confirmed Todoroki's name and noted his relationship to Endeavor. Todoroki only nodded, too annoyed and worried to speak. The detective asked what the son of the number 2 pro hero was doing looking so beaten in the middle of the night. Todoroki hesitated, silent and unsure. Todoroki worried whether Aizawa had advised him correctly as the detective picked up the form on the table and studied it with attention. When Tsukachi finished, he looked surprised and asked whether Todoroki was claiming that his father had done this to him. Todoroki confirmed that and said he did not yet have enough evidence to take action against his father. He added that he had not wanted to come in, but someone outside had convinced him to. Tsukachi sighed and leaned back, commenting that it was late to be dealing with this. He then told Todoroki that the police would provide surveillance, but Todoroki needed to obtain photographs or video evidence. Todoroki agreed. Tsukachi stood and left, warning Todoroki to be careful as he departed. Soon after, Aizawa arrived and embraced Todoroki gently, treating him like something fragile. Todoroki patted Aizawa's arm and rose from his seat. Noticing Aizawa's messy appearance, Todoroki asked if he was okay. Aizawa gave a strained laugh and reassured him that he was fine, but Todoroki could tell the response was forced. Aizawa said he needed to get home, and Todoroki agreed, offering to treat Aizawa at his place because Aizawa looked rough. Aizawa accepted and hurried with Todoroki out of the police station. Time passed. Izuku winced as he worked to clean Todoroki's wounds. Todoroki squirmed and thrashed on the dresser where he sat, resisting the treatment. Izuku tried to calm him, insisting that he knew the right pressure to use while cleaning. Todoroki complained that Izuku was pressing too hard. Izuku countered that he was being careful. Izuku reminded him to stay still so they could finish. The room was messy from Todoroki knocking things off the dresser in his agitation. Izuku felt grateful that his fathers were not home to see the chaos. He held Todoroki's thigh steady and washed the remaining burn with a damp rag, taking care not to pop any blisters while cleaning the area. Todoroki acted childish through most of the process, making it difficult, but Izuku persisted until the dressing was secure. When Izuku finished, he wrapped the burn and held out his hands so Todoroki could hop down from the dresser. Izuku paused to look into Todoroki's eyes and found them striking, almost mesmerizing. They stood that way for a long moment until the sound of the front door and a loud announcement of someone arriving home snapped them out of it. Both of them blushed. Izuku released Todoroki's hand and hurried him out the window. Todoroki exchanged a quick goodbye with a small smirk and then ran into the night. Izuku closed the window quickly and went to greet his fathers. Time skip. The next day at school, Izuku expected Todoroki to acknowledge him, but Todoroki remained distant. They were preparing to go to the unforeseen simulation joint. Izuku watched Todoroki from across the room while they waited for the bus. Todoroki brushed past Izuku and dropped a small slip of paper. Izuku picked it up and read the neat note that explained Todoroki's father kept tabs on him and suggested they talk on the bus. Izuku slipped the paper into his pocket and nodded to indicate he had received it. Todoroki answered the nod and looked toward where the bus would arrive. Izuku put in his headphones and listened to music. When the bus arrived, everyone boarded excitedly for the US Day. Izuku and Todoroki both wore the same neutral expressions. There was only one seat available at the back, and each took it. Todoroki sat next to him. Izuku asked Todoroki how he was, and Todoroki replied that he was well and asked Izuku the same. Izuku told Todoroki about the band he had been listening to and offered an earbud. Todoroki accepted and began tapping his head to the rhythm. Izuku felt tired from staying up late and, without thinking, rested his head on Todoroki's shoulder. Todoroki tensed briefly, then relaxed, and Izuku fell asleep. At the stop for the training center, Todoroki looked down at Izuku sleeping against his shoulder and allowed a small smile before returning to his usual composed expression. He gently nudged Izuku and told him that they had arrived, and Izuku slowly lifted his head and rubbed his eyes. Todoroki thought the moment had been quietly endearing. Todoroki then noted that they could probably talk inside the facility, believing that his father would not be watching there. Deku thought his father used random students to keep him in check. Aizawa nodded, yawned, and then jumped up and walked out of the bus. The class entered the dome-shaped training facility, buzzing with excitement. Pro Hero number 13 walked out to greet them and addressed the students about the dangers of their quirks. explaining that the facility existed for safe practice and rescue training. Kaminari interrupted in surprise at the presence of what looked like staged villains. Aizawa turned toward Kaminari and warned the students that those figures were not fake, and he ordered Kaminari to try to contact the school. Kaminari attempted to use his quirk but found the signals jammed. The assembled villains announced their intent to kill the symbol of peace, All Might, and Deku snickered that they could have him. Aizawa put on his goggles and moved to engage the appearing villains, ordering Ida to get help. Deku watched his father fight with growing anxiety, wondering if Aizawa could hold his own. Todoroki noticed Deku's nervousness and took his hand to offer silent reassurance. Deku thanked Todoroki and suggested they move to join the others. They headed toward the group, but a man surrounded by mist blocked their path and mocked the students. Deku waved, catching the man off guard for a moment, and Bakugo and Kirishima seized that distraction to attack. The mist-covered man responded by teleporting half the class to different locations, including Deku and Todoroki. Deku landed hard and plunged into the water, fighting for air. He barely had time to react before Tsuyu pulled him from the water with her tongue. Deku thanked her, and Tsuyu asked to be called by her nickname. She explained that their opponents likely did not know the students' quirks, which would explain why a student with a frog-type quirk had been placed in the water zone. She noted that the villains had the advantage in the water and were waiting for the students to make a move on their terms. Tsuyu suggested waking Shiro, creating a whirlpool to move everyone away from the water, and then using Shiro's tape to immobilize the villains, and Deku agreed. Tsuyu woke Shiro while Deku turned to face the villains and tried to get a reaction by acting friendly. The villains ignored him and insulted him instead, but Deku adopted a serious expression and prepared to act. With a plan in motion, Deku created a dark-shadowed strike into the water to disrupt the villain's footing. Tsuyu used her tongue to catch him as he fell, and Shiro blasted tape into the swirling water to tangle the attackers. The three students landed behind a rock with a view of Aizawa's battle. Deku watched his father fight with a mixture of awe and worry. He wondered if the villains had something that could really hurt All Might, and feared they were in serious danger. A student pointed to a strange bird-like villain with exposed features, and the group considered the possibility that this creature was the real threat. The bird-like villain suddenly moved over to Aizawa, and the teacher was momentarily stunned before trying to fend it off. The creature overpowered Aizawa and smashed him into the ground. The students flinched as Aizawa was driven down, and a sharp crack suggested a serious injury. Tsuyu screamed when a villain reached toward her, but nothing further happened to her. The blue-haired leader took note, remarking on Aizawa's ability to cancel quirks even while being attacked, and ordered Nomu to keep Aizawa pinned. Tsuyu and Shiro retreated, but Deku's attention remained fixed on his father, who was losing consciousness and appeared gravely hurt. Deku's fear triggered a sudden change in the training area. The space around him seemed to chill, and the air thickened as shadows pooled and moved at his command. The Nomu remained focused on its task, but the surrounding villains were pushed back by the sudden force. Deku pressed forward, his eyes glowing with determination, and confronted the blue-haired villain who seemed to be the leader. He demanded the villain's name, threatening serious harm if the answer was not given. The villain, struggling against the pressure, finally whispered his name, Shigaraki. Deku then applied focused pressure to subdue Shigaraki, forcing him into SBMSN and leaving him incapacitated with injured limbs so he could no longer continue his attack. The surrounding students watched as the immediate threat was neutralized and the chaos began to settle. At this point Deku was unhinged. He no longer cared about rules or consequences. He was focused only on protecting his father and stopping anyone who tried to hurt him. When All Might and the other pro-heroes entered the building, they were at a loss for words. The air felt heavy and every movement seemed difficult. All Might followed the students' gazes and declared that such behavior was unacceptable for an aspiring hero. He did not want to approach, humiliated and shaken, but he felt compelled to correct his student. He felt physically ill as he moved closer and could not help but marvel at the raw power the boy displayed. From below, Aizawa rasped a warning that Deku would kill him and that the boy was not himself. All Might insisted that he had to intervene. He picked Aizawa up and tried to quiet him, telling him he had things under control. Deku saw someone lift his father and perceived an enemy. He used his shadows to levitate his father toward the entrance and struck All Might, shoving him aside and sending him tumbling across the room. Deku pushed All Might down and struck him, and All Might was powerless to respond. He believed he had to stop anyone who threatened his father. Aizawa lay injured and struggling to speak. He pushed himself up despite the pain from his injury to his side and used his ability to nullify Deku's quirk. The nullification allowed the villains to escape, shaken and frightened, but it did not immediately reach Deku. Snipe fired to try to stop him and struck Deku's shoulder, but Deku did not flinch. Aizawa began to cry, feeling helpless and fearing that only fatal force might stop Deku. Aizawa called urgently for Izuku, insisting he was fine even as each word cost him. Deku looked toward his father, who stood with his arms outstretched. Deku began to regain control, tears in his eyes, and sprinted to his father's side. Then everything went black for Deku. All Might struck him, knocking him to the ground and leaving him unconscious. Mr. Aizawa could only scream and cry in his spot. Hisashi ran to his son and cradled him, demanding that All Might leave before anyone was hurt further. All Might fled, terrified. Those who had been trapped emerged from their zones to find Deku motionless in present Mick's arms. The sight stunned everyone. Bakugo vomited and Todoroki fell to his knees. Uraraka snickered and Momo smacked her. The whole class was horrified. Time passed. Todoroki woke in a hospital room, the light harsh against his eyes. He noticed a cast on his arm and, remembering how Aizawa had looked, felt a surge of fear that Aizawa might not have survived. He quickly wiped his tears and took in the plain surroundings. His father burst into the room in a fury. He grabbed Todoroki by the collar and berated him, pressing him and accusing him of weakness. The grip made Todoroki choke and gasp. The room felt unbearably hot as his father shook him and shouted. Tears tracked down Todoroki's face while his father's anger grew and his voice took on a manic edge. Those thoughts blurred, and everything went black. Izuku lay in his hospital bed, pretending to be asleep while his father and another man argued about the situation and the consequences for the school. When he sat up and announced himself, his father called his name loudly, and his other parent hugged him with relief, relieved he had survived. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Police and a few pro-heroes were gathered outside Todoroki's room. Izuku's parents noted the location and his concern spiked. Ignoring the pain in his body, Izuku tore out his IVs and pushed himself out of bed to check on Todoroki. Hospital staff and officers tried to stop him, but when officers blocked the door he made a barrier of shadows to keep them at bay and forced his way through. Inside the room, Endeavor was holding Todoroki down while officers attempted to intervene. Izuku reacted quickly. He used Shadow to shove Endeavor off and pinned him until the officers could apply quirk suppression cuffs. The police took over and restrained Endeavor. Izuku moved to Todoroki's bedside and saw a faint mark at his neck and dried tear stains on his cheeks. Emotions roiled, but the situation was now in the hands of the authorities. Hospital security allowed Izuku's parents to enter. They scolded him, worried for his own injuries and safety, but ultimately agreed when he insisted he needed to stay with Todoroki. The officers questioned Izuku briefly about any history of abuse or sightings of mistreatment, and the nurses, concerned for Todoroki's recovery, gently ushered the officers out once they had what they needed. About an hour later, Todoroki's eyelids fluttered and he woke. Izuku held his hand. Todoroki squeezed to get his attention, and Izuku, mindful of Todoroki's sore throat, set up a simple code of hand squeezes to communicate. Todoroki responded with 3 small squeezes. Todoroki and Mr. Aizawa spoke for a while after the nurses noticed he was awake. When the nurses came in, Aizawa stood, offered a small smile, and left the room. Todoroki did not want him to go, but the visit had helped. After 2 days, Aizawa was well enough to return to class. The doctors and nurses kept telling him how lucky he was that he had not suffered a concussion and had only a few broken ribs. Aizawa did not care. He was simply relieved to be alive so he could still confront All Might and Shigaraki. Todoroki had left the hospital a day after him since he did not require further observation, but Todoroki visited whenever he could to give updates about his father. When Aizawa walked into class, The room fell silent as everyone remembered the raw power he had displayed against even All Might. Aizawa waved and sat next to Todoroki, then leaned in to ask whether the man was in jail yet. Todoroki replied that the trial was in a couple of days and that the man had effectively incriminated himself at the hospital, so jail seemed likely. Aizawa muttered that he hated the man. There was talk that Aizawa had retaliated at the scene but had been pulled away before it could escalate. The whole class seemed surprised when Todoroki smiled, and Aizawa and Todoroki exchanged a friendly high five. A teacher interrupted to scold them for lingering, noting that first PRD had started 3 minutes ago. The boys apologized in unison, and the teacher nodded before going to the blackboard. Once the class was settled, the teacher announced that the annual UA Sports Festival was next week and reminded everyone to be prepared. The class brightened with excitement. Somewhere else, a group quietly confirmed that plans were ready and that they only needed to recruit a few more people. One of them swore he would make sure the target would not survive this plot. It was the day of the sports festival and the class buzzed with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Todoroki and Izuku sat in a corner waiting for events to start. They were unusually calm. Izuku, who would have preferred to sleep, had been compelled to attend the event and face the competition. Todoroki predicted that the winners would likely be Izuku or Bakugo, with a chance for himself. They listened to the distant roar of the crowd as Present Mike announced the beginning of the games, and they exchanged a quick high five before stepping out. The audience cheered. Monoma made an exaggerated bow to the crowd, and Izuku called out a practical correction so fans could see the bow properly. Monoma began to approach Izuku but was intercepted and steadied by Kendo, and the class laughed at the recovery. Midnight then pointed to Izuku as the class representative. He went pale and Todoroki explained that Izuku had probably been chosen for scoring highest on the hero exam. Izuku steadied himself and made a brief pledge on behalf of the class, which at first drew silence and then a warm cheer. He returned to Todoroki relieved, and Todoroki complimented him in a way that made Izuku blush when Todoroki ruffled his hair. The first years moved to the opening event, the race. Midnight explained the course and the students lined up. When the race began, the competitors took off at once, but Izuku lingered for a moment, watching everyone's backs. He wished Todoroki well before creating a small shadow platform and hovering above the field to keep an eye on him. Todoroki used his ice to block obstacles and slow the mechanical hazards, and Izuku watched with quiet pride. When he grew bored, he dropped from the platform and ran alongside Todoroki, teasing him about being mean when Todoroki's ice kept things in check. They reached a series of stone pillars flanking a large pit. Izuku floated on his shadow next to Todoroki as Todoroki crossed. The rest of the students followed close behind. The final obstacle was a minefield. Izuku drifted across it while the others navigated more cautiously. Todoroki offered Izuku a sarcastic smile and a rude gesture before concentrating on the course. Bakugo pushed to catch up, and he and Todoroki jostled competitively for first place. Izuku hopped off his shadow and sprinted for the finish, claiming first place. He then stood by the stage and rested as the others finished. When Todoroki arrived, he crouched down and poked Izuku's cheek to wake him gently, and Izuku protested sleepily in a playful exchange. Todoroki tackled him lightly in jest, and they both laughed until they ended up on the ground in an awkward, comical tangle. Both of them flushed with embarrassment. Todoroki offered his hand to help Izuku up and reminded him that most of the competitors were done, they were only waiting on a few people. Izuku accepted the hand and rose, trying to hide his blush. Midnight announced the next event, a cavalry battle where teams collected points. Teams formed quickly. Izuku initially found himself without a group, but Todoroki chose to stay with him, indifferent to the points. Hatsum approached them, radiating excitement and asking to join so she could test her latest inventions. Izuku and Todoroki exchanged looks, taken aback by her energy, and both agreed. Hatsum proudly presented a small device designed to help the team float above the ground, and then went off to recruit a final teammate. The competition continued with the usual mix of strategy, chaos, and spirited rivalry, and the class moved through the events together, supporting one another and enjoying the festival atmosphere. Hatsum told Izuku that he was very helpful, and Izuku rolled his eyes while he tried to pay attention to her inventions. A few minutes later Todoroki returned with Tokoyami and offered Aizawa his assistance, admitting he was not sure how he could help but that he would try his best. Todoroki explained that they could combine quirks, using his power as a barrier while Dark Shadow launched occasional attacks. Tokoyami nodded and they took their positions. Izuku formed a shadow barrier around the team and counted down to the start. At the signal, the other teams chased after them. Izuku eased the workload on the powered shoes with a bit of his quirk, and they stayed several feet above the ground before the shoes finally failed. Teams waited below, and Izuku made a playful rude gesture before creating a shadow cloud and hovering above them, sticking his tongue out. Dark Shadow pilfered a few headbands from the opposing teams. The scoreboard climbed steadily, and Todoroki slid away from the crowd to the side of the arena where no one else stood. Izuku smiled and exchanged a high five with Todoroki. With enough points to secure first place given Izuku's previous performance, they decided to hold their position as the final minute ticked down. Bakugo charged toward them, but Izuku used his barrier to keep him at bay. Bakugo exploded with frustration and shouted at Izuku, demanding to be let through, while Izuku warned him that there were only seconds left and suggested he try someone else. Bakugo continued to demand passage. Izuku let Bakugo vent by throwing explosions while Mina fired acidic attacks that struck the barrier. When the round ended, Izuku's team remained in first, Bakugo's in second, and Shinszo's in third. Everyone cleared the stadium for the break. Izuku and Todoroki walked to the food stands. Todoroki ordered soba and Izuku ordered katsudon. Izuku noted that Todoroki always chose soba, and Todoroki playfully glared while pointing out that Izuku always chose katsudon. They sat and ate together, and Izuku found Todoroki quietly endearing. Izuku studied the tournament bracket and frowned. If he advanced past Hitoshi Shinszo, he would face Todoroki next, and if he defeated Todoroki he would face Bakugo afterwards, something he resented. He preferred to avoid Bakugo's confrontational style. Todoroki rested a hand on Izuku's head, and Izuku told him that the bracket showed they would face each other. Todoroki examined the board and asked Izuku not to go easy. Izuku assured him quietly that he would not. When Izuku's first match arrived, Shinszo stepped into the ring with a determined expression. Izuku noticed a resemblance between Shinszo and Aizawa and couldn't help a small, surprised laugh. The match began with an official signal, and Shinszo immediately taunted Izuku about his privileged start and his powerful quirk, suggesting Izuku had never had to face hardships. Izuku was taken aback by the question but answered quietly that he did know what it felt like to be uncertain and afraid. Realizing Shinszo's quirk was voice-activated, Izuku recognized that his body had been frozen momentarily. He assessed how much control Shinszo had and discovered there was still room to move. Summoning a small shadow, he pushed himself forward and reached the boundary to secure the win. After the match, Izuku patted the sore spot on his head and noted that it had hurt. Shinszo looked shaken but composed himself. Izuku told him that he understood the feeling and that he would feel sorry for having to defeat him, but he needed to advance to face Bakugo and would mention Shinszo to others who could help. Using his shadows, Izuku pushed Shinszo gently toward the edge and the referee declared Izuku the victor. Izuku offered his hand to help Shinszo up, but Shinszo insisted he could rise on his own, then left the ring. Back in the waiting area, Izuku chewed his lip as his upcoming match with Todoroki approached. Bakugo passed through the hall, scowling, and Izuku mimicked the sound. Bakugo snapped insults at him, and Izuku replied with a sarcastic retort, which only irked Bakugo further. Kirishima arrived and called out to Bakugo, distracting him and allowing Izuku to slip away. When the time came, Izuku climbed the stage and saw Todoroki waiting. They exchanged smiles and took their stances. The match began with the official signal, and Izuku dashed forward. Todoroki used ice to keep distance, but Izuku broke through and summoned shadows to try to push him out of the ring. Todoroki evaded and glided forward on a sheet of ice, releasing a blast of ice that Izuku dodged. Izuku wondered why Todoroki had not used his fire side. Todoroki explained that his father's quirk was something he refused to use and that he intended to surpass his father using only his mother's power. Izuku thought that stance made little sense. They moved into a rapid exchange of blows, a fluid, high-energy duel of strikes and counters that unfolded like a choreographed fight. Todoroki's point of view. Izuku told Todoroki that he could use his quirk to help people, but he was still letting that other person affect his life. Todoroki jumped back and giggled at the encouragement, and Izuku added that it was Todoroki's quirk, not anyone else's. Todoroki felt as if the sun had come to him when Izuku stood there smiling, his nose scrunching in a familiar way. Todoroki's heart skipped a beat and a deep blush spread across his cheeks. He smiled back and Izuku nodded. Todoroki's left side warmed and a small flame flickered free. Aizawa laughed and praised him for finally showing some fire. Izuku's point of view. Izuku was thrilled that he had gotten Todoroki to use his fire. Todoroki moved to the opposite edge of the match ring and tried to keep Izuku away with ice, but Izuku broke through and pushed Todoroki out of the ring. The crowd cheered loudly, and Izuku winced at the noise before smiling and helping Todoroki to his feet. Todoroki thanked Aizawa, and Izuku asked what he was thanking him for, but Todoroki ignored the question and headed toward Recovery Girl's room to rest. Izuku prepared mentally for his upcoming match against Bakugo. He sat in the stands and watched Bakugo dismantle his pink-haired opponent with aggressive force. Some people in the audience criticized how hard Bakugo was going, but Izuku saw it as Bakugo acknowledging his opponent's strength. He admired how the pink-haired student collected rubble and prepared to use it, thinking that it took courage and strategy. The announcer's voice blared over the loudspeaker, making Izuku's ears ring. When Uraraka put her plan into action and released the debris she had gathered, Bakugo looked up, smirked, and detonated it. Izuku stood and slipped his hands into his pockets, deciding it was time to go. Izuku walked into the waiting room, drinking water and rehearsing strategies for facing Bakugo. Before long it was time. He walked into the arena and saw Bakugo looking eager. Izuku waved to him in a casual greeting. Midnight counted down, and Bakugo launched himself toward Izuku, propelling with explosions. Bakugo swung a right hook at Izuku's face, but Izuku dodged, grabbed his arm, and pulled him down. Izuku kneed Bakugo in the stomach and kicked him away. Izuku had decided to challenge himself by not using his quirk at all for this match. He moved toward Bakugo with a confident, deliberate pace. Bakugo rose and charged again, attempting a kick to Izuku's midsection. In one smooth motion, Izuku grabbed Bakugo's leg and pinned him to the ground. Izuku made it clear that he had not needed his quirk to win this position, suggesting that it should be an eye-opener for Bakugo. Bakugo clenched his teeth, broke free of the hold, and looked feral with fury. He launched himself and struck a rapid explosion so close to Izuku's face that there was no time to react. Izuku felt searing heat across his face and cradled it, the sensation bringing back how long it had been since Bakugo had attacked him like this. Bakugo then fired a powerful blast at Izuku's arm, and the impact left the arm badly damaged and smoking but without graphic detail. Guilt flashed across Bakugo's face, but he followed with another blast. Izuku was stunned and unable to move his legs at first. He focused on calming himself and planted his feet to remain steady despite the pain. Once he found a measure of calm, Izuku pushed through the pain and kicked Bakugo in the side. Bakugo doubled over, gasping, and Izuku used the opening to send Bakugo out of bounds with a controlled use of his quirk. Izuku smiled, then collapsed to the ground as his vision blurred, but he felt no regret. Todoroki raced to Aizawa's room the second he saw that he was hurt. The hallways felt longer than usual. He had been in the stadium after being patched up when he saw Aizawa pass out. From a distance the scorch marks along his arms had looked minor. Up close they were clearly severe. Panting, Todoroki reached the door and stepped inside. Deku and Bakugo sat on adjacent beds. Todoroki scowled at Bakugo, who only had a few scratches and dirt. Bakugo began to apologize, but Todoroki cut him off with a raised hand and told him to be quiet because he was not the one who needed to apologize. Bakugo nodded awkwardly and stared at the off-white walls. Todoroki crouched beside Aizawa and took in the battered face, the bandaged arm. He sat in the chair next to the bed. Recovery Girl tapped him with her cane and explained that she was putting Todoroki in charge of Aizawa because she had not been able to heal him completely. His wounds were too severe and he could not use his arms. Todoroki nodded and she left to tell Bakugo he was free to go. Bakugo stood and left quickly, and Todoroki wondered why he looked so ashamed when he had caused the injuries. Aizawa stirred and opened his eyes. He tried to sit up, and Todoroki reached to help adjust the pillows and support him. Todoroki became aware of Aizawa's breath nearby and felt a brief flush of embarrassment, but he focused on helping him sit comfortably. Aizawa asked if Todoroki was okay. Todoroki assured him he was fine, and Aizawa's lips twitched in amusement at Todoroki's nervousness. Aizawa teased Todoroki about appearing flustered, and Todoroki refused to meet his gaze. When Aizawa asked why Todoroki was avoiding him and reached to lift his chin, Todoroki tried to hide his reaction. He checked the clock. It was 4. Todoroki reminded Aizawa that Recovery Girl had said the awards would be given in 20 minutes and offered to get the wheelchair. Aizawa pouted briefly, but Todoroki returned with the wheelchair and said he would help him in. He lifted Aizawa carefully and helped him into the chair. Aizawa flushed, and Todoroki leaned in to tell him they should head to the awards now. Aizawa felt a shiver when Todoroki spoke close, but he settled into his seat. Todoroki told him they had arrived at the podium and that he would pick him up when the awards were finished. Todoroki then went to stand in the third-place spot while Aizawa remained in the first-place position. Periodically Todoroki smiled toward him while they waited for Bakugo to arrive. When Bakugo arrived, the awards began. The teachers tried to keep Bakugo still, and Aizawa's distress grew as the seconds passed. Aizawa pushed through his discomfort and removed the muzzle, explaining that he should have done it sooner. He then fell back into his wheelchair and the awards and photos continued. After the ceremony, Todoroki guided Aizawa away from the crowd and into the hallway. Todoroki asked if Aizawa was okay and Aizawa said he was fine. When Todoroki asked why Aizawa had removed the muzzle, Aizawa trusted him and explained that he had acted because Bakugo had been having flashbacks from a villain attack in middle school. Todoroki smiled and remarked on how endearing Aizawa could be. Aizawa blushed, and Todoroki knelt to be at eye level to reassure him. Their faces leaned close in a charged moment that felt like a magnetic pull, but their interaction was interrupted when Bakugo stormed into the hall. Bakugo demanded to know why Aizawa had acted the way he did at the awards. Aizawa told him he had seen fear in Bakugo's eyes and felt any decent person would help. Bakugo accused Aizawa of pity and lashed out with anger, calling him names. Aizawa held his ground, insisting he had never looked down on Bakugo and that he had respected him. Bakugo's shock turned back to rage and he declared the matter not over, then slammed the door and left. Todoroki asked Aizawa if he wanted a ride home, and Aizawa agreed. The walk home was awkward and quiet. At Aizawa's front door, Todoroki said they had arrived and Aizawa thanked him. Aizawa gave Todoroki a quick, friendly gesture before going inside. Todoroki waved goodbye and left. Inside, Aizawa's father noticed how happy he seemed and asked why. Aizawa replied that he had just thanked Todoroki for his help, prompting his father's excited reaction. Shoyuta cut off Present Mike's hysterics when Present Mike began speculating loudly about the nature of a kiss and whether Izuku and someone else were dating. Present Mike threatened to demand grandchildren while fussing over the details. Shoyuta told him to leave Izuku alone. Izuku had just come out of the hospital and could not handle more nagging. Present Mike pouted and began cleaning a broken plate but brightened when there was a new announcement. Present Mike and Shoyuta revealed that they had adopted someone. A purple-haired boy stepped out of the empty guest room and raised a lazy hand in greeting. Izuku blinked slowly and then smiled, still feeling awkward from a match earlier that day but hiding it well. Izuku asked Shoyuta to move his chair to the table. Present Mike rolled the chair over and left to finish dinner. The purple-haired boy, Shinszo, took the seat beside Izuku and twirled his fork before exchanging curious looks with him. Izuku asked how long Shinszo had known about the adoption. Shinszo replied that he had learned about it only the previous week but had been told to keep it a surprise. Izuku smiled and told him that keeping secrets like that was a game they played. Hisashi entered the room carrying a glass container of a mystery casserole with pink oven mitts on his hands. He explained that he and Shoyuta made a game of guessing the food, and whoever guessed correctly won. Shinszo glanced at the dish and, wanting an edge, served himself a generous portion. Izuku made a mischievous wager for the last coffee pod. Shoyuta and Shinszo protested that coffee was sacred and that betting it was unfair, but Izuku stood firm. The competitive mood spurred everyone on. Shinszo guessed tater tot casserole with deadpan d'Elvoy. Izuku guessed ziti, while Shoyuta guessed shepherd's pie. Hisashi tasted the food and, after a moment, confirmed that it was tater tot casserole, which set Shinszo off into delighted laughter and Izuku grumbling about rubbing it in. After dinner, Shinszo and Izuku went to unpack Shinsu's room. Izuku noticed that Shinszo had fewer belongings than he did and joked about being a light packer. Shinszo mentioned that he had been adopted at the beginning of the school year. When Izuku asked where Shinsu's parents were, Shinszo flinched, then opened up reluctantly. He explained that his father had left when he was young and that his mother had been murdered. His parents had abused him because of his quirk, and he had spent time in the foster system where the abuse continued. Eventually, Shoyuta and Hisashi had found out and taken him out of foster care. Izuku listened quietly and helped put away the few books Shinszo owned. They finished packing in a comfortable silence, relieved to finally have someone to relate to. Izuku invited Shinszo to play video games in his room across the hall, but Shinszo declined politely, saying he needed sleep. Izuku went to his room. From the living room, Shoyuta asked if the boys were getting along, and they both affirmed that they were. Present Mike, braiding his hair nearby, called out goodnights and exchanged warm farewells with them. That night Izuku felt happy to have a brother, but Shinsu's story left him feeling guilty and small. He told himself he should not compare his pain to someone else's, though the thought did not stop the flood of memories. He sat at the edge of his bed, feeling the ache in his burned arms and the weight of keeping things hidden from Shoyuta and Present Mike. He had convinced his therapist and his parents that he was fine, but he had fallen back into harmful habits. He reached for a hidden blade and after a moment of trembling, he hurt himself again, making shallow wounds and then dressing them. When he finished, he crawled back into bed and fell into an exhausted sleep with his body covered in bandages and bruises. Shinszo woke with a jolt, heart racing from a nightmare of being punished. In the dream his foster mother had lashed out at him while under the influence, and he had felt helpless on the floor. He sat up sweating and retched until Izuku, who had come to check on him with bandaged hands, offered a trash bin. After vomiting, Shinszo wiped his mouth and steadied himself. Izuku told Shinszo that he used to have similar nightmares because his mother had been killed in front of him, and that he still had them sometimes. Shinszo acknowledged this, too tired to say more, and said that he was going to leave the room for a bit. A short pause followed as they both collected themselves. He told him to come to his room if he needed anything, then laid down and tried to sleep. Izuku wiped sweat from the other's forehead with a towel and dealt with a trash bag of vomit, tying it closed before maneuvering his injured arms and bulky wheelchair through the hallways. He stewed over Kaken's aggression and vowed to confront him at school. After he discarded the bag, he went back to bed. Aizawa closed the door behind Izuku, leaving Todoroki standing there, smiling to himself as he touched his lips and replayed a surprising, affectionate moment. He ran home to tell Fuyumi, bursting into her room breathless. Fuyumi, taken aback by his bright grin, hugged him and asked him to tell everything. Todoroki recounted the festival, their teasing, and the unexpected tenderness he had experienced, and they both squealed with excitement. Natsuo entered and groaned for them to quiet down because he was trying to prepare dinner. Todoroki reverted to his usual stoic expression, apologized to Natsuo, and went to his room, a small smile lingering whenever he thought of what had happened. He checked his phone repeatedly through the night hoping for a message, but there were none, and he went to sleep with a frown. Bands of sunlight woke Izuku the next day. The wounds from his fight with Kaken and a throbbing headache made getting up painful. He groped for his phone and blushed when he saw several messages from Todoroki, who had been trying to wake him and had asked him to text back before apologizing and leaving him alone. Izuku read them over and over, annoyed at himself for oversleeping when he finally realized it was already mid-afternoon. He called Todoroki, who answered warmly. Todoroki agreed to come over to talk, offering katsudon and boba and teasing that he would tend to Izuku's sore and injured state. Izuku laughed at the offer and asked for a little help straightening his room before Todoroki arrived. He called for Pa, who came right away and helped pick up clothes and trash. When they finished, Pa gave him a high five and left. Izuku chose a gray hoodie and black pants and struggled to put them on over his bandages until Shinszo appeared and helped him slip the hoodie into place. Shinszo laughed and adjusted it for him, then stepped back. Todoroki arrived carrying a bag and set it on the dresser. He and Izuku shared a quick, relieved smile as Todoroki revealed a Tupperware of katsudon. Izuku opened it despite the sting and groaned, and Todoroki gently reminded him that his arms weren't fully healed and offered to feed him instead. Todoroki fed him small bites with chopsticks, and Izuku praised the food enthusiastically. Todoroki chided him lightly about his language, and Izuku stuck out his tongue in response before calling Todoroki the best. Todoroki found Izuku's reaction endearing. They shared a quiet, heartfelt moment together without anything more physical happening, simply enjoying each other's company and the comfort of being close. After a while, they both took a steadying breath and settled into the rest of the afternoon together. Todoroki pressed their foreheads together with Izuku and they both grinned. Todoroki asked Izuku Aizawa to be his boyfriend, and Izuku's breath hitched before he agreed. Todoroki made a small victory gesture that made Izuku giggle. When they noticed the food, Todoroki stood to retrieve it and Izuku teased him about his language, earning a playful glare from Todoroki. They talked for hours until Todoroki finally had to leave. After Izuku insisted on seeing him off, Todoroki pushed him gently toward the door and said goodbye before standing to go. When Todoroki had gone, a screech came from the kitchen as Pa rushed in to ask if Todoroki had indeed kissed Izuku. Izuku confirmed that they were dating now. Pa hugged Izuku tightly, forgetting that he was still injured, and Izuku winced as he asked his father to be careful. Pa apologized and beamed with happiness for him. They agreed it would be nice to have Todoroki over for dinner, and Dad warned Todoroki in his typical theatrical way that if Todoroki ever hurt Izuku, there would be consequences. Dad then wandered off to his room. Izuku agreed to let his parents help set things up. Todoroki was relieved that Sunday passed quickly. Monday brought internships, though, and Todoroki groaned inwardly when he learned they would be at different places all week. He wanted to spend time with Izuku, but the schedule made it impossible. He received a thick stack of internship papers and skimmed them for anything interesting. One entry caught his eye, a low-profile hero with a quirk similar to his. He glanced at Izuku's stack and noticed it was even taller. The class buzzed with questions about how Izuku had so many options, and Izuku reacted with bored eye rolls that Todoroki found quietly amusing. Izuku felt overwhelmed by the crowd of classmates gathered around him and scanned for help from Todoroki, who returned a mischievous smirk. To shut the conversation down, Izuku placed his finger on his stack and signaled to Uraraka, the classmate he disliked most, that he had a trick to show her. Although he was supposed to wait until Recovery Girl finished healing him that afternoon, getting rid of the crowd felt more important. When Uraraka obligingly nodded, Izuku used his quirk to burn the stack of papers until only a pile of ashes remained, then scattered the ashes through the classroom. The classmates stared in shock. Izuku closed his eyes and let their reactions wash over him, falling asleep with a smug grin. A warm hand shook him awake. Todoroki stood over him and said it was time to go home, explaining that their teacher had given them a day off. Izuku bleary-eyed thanked Todoroki and wished they could have talked at lunch before the week of internships. Todoroki suggested going on a date after school and mentioned he had already asked Izuku's father, who had agreed to leave them alone. Izuku reminded Todoroki that they needed to visit Recovery Girl so she could finish his treatment, and Todoroki pushed him toward the clinic. At the clinic, the old woman admonished Izuku for using his quirk before he was fully healed and tapped him with her cane. Izuku stuck his tongue out at her when her back was turned. The appointment was quick. Recovery Girl checked his arms and legs, took his wheelchair, and Izuku tried to stand only to find his legs too weak. Todoroki turned, squatted, and offered Izuku a piggyback ride. Izuku laughed and jumped on. Todoroki shouldered him and they left while Recovery Girl returned to her television shows. They walked through the streets, drawing a few curious looks, and headed to the cafe. On the way, the two argued playfully about Recovery Girl's name and whether it was worth the effort to change it. Todoroki pointed out the paperwork and expense involved. Izuku suggested a joke solution of offering her money, and Todoroki sighed before carrying Izuku into the cafe and seating him. Todoroki sat across from Izuku, studying the menu mounted behind him. He asked what Zawa wanted. Izuku answered that he wanted cake pops and hot chocolate. Todoroki laughed at Izuku's insistence and stood to get the food. Izuku touched his cheek where Todoroki had briefly brushed it and smiled when Todoroki returned with the coffee and cake pops. Todoroki smiled back and handed him the treats. Todoroki then coughed and said he preferred to be called Shoto. Izuku's chest warmed at that, and he replied playfully that he could be called Izuku if his noble steed so desired. Todoroki chuckled and bit into his Danish. After the cafe, they walked to the park near Izuku's house. Shoto set Izuku down next to the swings so he could get on. They both sat on the swings in silence, watching the sunset. Shoto suddenly looked as if he might cry, and Izuku, worried, got off his swing to comfort him. Shoto nuzzled into the crook of Izuku's neck and hugged him, then moved so they weren't at an awkward angle. Izuku asked what was wrong. Shoto explained that they had received the trial date in the mail and that it was tomorrow. He did not want to face the man responsible, and he was afraid the man might get off and hurt someone. Izuku cupped Shoto's face and gave him an understanding smile. He reassured Shoto that the evidence was strong and that, even if the man did something reckless, it was unlikely he would get away with it. Shoto nodded and hugged him again, grateful that Izuku would come to the trial. Izuku thought fiercely about how best to ensure justice would be served. Shoto reached out to comfort him, and they shared a quiet, comforting moment together. A few minutes later, Izuku's phone dinged and lit up, revealing a message from his worried father demanding to know where he was and warning that he would send the police if Izuku did not come home in 15 minutes. Panicked, Izuku told Shoto he had to go. Shoto nodded, picked up their book bags, and helped Izuku to his feet, supporting him under the shoulder as they walked home. Shoto dropped Izuku off at the porch and gave a quick wave before leaving. As Izuku turned, his father opened the door and pulled him inside by the ear. His father asked where he had been. Izuku searched the room for an ally, but his father and Shinszo were suppressing grins. His father, in a theatrical parental reprimand, pinched his nose with chopsticks and warned him to tell them next time. Everyone called to dinner, and Shinszo mouth made a kissy face at Izuku as he passed, prompting Izuku to respond with a rude hand gesture. He limped toward his room, tossed his book bag inside, and then hobbled back to the dining room. They had spaghetti and salad. Halfway through dinner, Izuku remembered that he had accidentally burned his father's internship paper earlier while handling his own burned documents. He sheepishly explained the mistake and asked if his father could print another copy. His father, exasperated but resigned, agreed and warned that he would not do it again. Izuku thanked him. Izuku then asked if he could attend Shoto's father's court trial to support him. His father asked why, and Izuku explained that it would be hard for Shoto and he wanted to be there. His father agreed but warned sternly that if Izuku were late again he would be very angry. Izuku laughed nervously and returned to his food while his mother's messages continued to show on his phone. Later, Izuku walked into the courtroom with Todoroki. Todoroki was visibly nervous about seeing his father again after the hospital incident. Izuku sat in the guest seating while Shoto walked up to the plaintiff area where his lawyer was already waiting. Shoto looked over his shoulder at Izuku like a nervous puppy, and Izuku offered a reassuring smile to remind him he was there. When the defendant, Endeavor, entered the courtroom, Todoroki's body tensed and went rigid. Endeavor's eyes fixed on Izuku with a cold glare. Izuku smiled and waved, but Endeavor scowled before taking his seat, restrained by anti-Quirk cuffs and accompanied by an officer and an elderly-looking lawyer. The judge brought the gavel down and the hearing began. These days, with the complexities Quirks had introduced, trials rarely lasted more than a few days. Considering all the evidence piling up against their favorite blazing public figure, the trial would be decided that day. Both sides pledged to tell the truth. Shoto's lawyer went to the lectern and delivered his opening testimony on Shoto's behalf before returning to his seat. Endeavor's lawyer, Mr. Kenji Ito, then spoke at length about his client's supposed innocence, and the narrator felt sick watching some jurors nod along despite witnesses who had seen Enji physically attack his already injured son. The narrator yawned and settled against the wooden bench, bracing for a day of the defense's theatrics and wondering how Shoto had endured 16 years of it. The trial had been underway for about an hour. Hospital staff and responding police officers had testified, and most observers privately concluded that the number 2 pro-hero had been abusive. It was time for Todoroki to give his statement, joined by his brother and sister. They all wore solemn expressions as they recalled the harsh things their father had done. Todoroki approached the lectern looking extremely nervous. He glanced toward the narrator for reassurance. The narrator smiled gently and he returned the smile before speaking. Todoroki addressed his father and recounted the abuse he had suffered. When he finished, the courtroom was appalled. A woman hired for her truth-based quirk had confirmed his testimony. The quirk had not been used earlier to keep appearances and because some people genuinely believed their behavior was training or protection rather than abuse. After testimony concluded, the jury deliberated for 30 long minutes. When they reached a decision, the judge brought everyone back into the courtroom. The narrator was allowed to sit with Shoto during the announcement, and they squeezed each other's hands. The judge announced that the jury had found Enji Todoroki guilty on charges including child endangerment, mental and physical child abuse, attempted murder, assault, and quirk endangerment, and that, taking his career into account, his sentence would be reduced from 80 to 60 years with no bail. Shoto turned to the narrator and pulled them into a tight embrace, holding them close and smiling through tears. They stayed wrapped in each other's arms, ignoring the father's threats echoing through the hall. After 10 minutes they separated. Todoroki suggested celebrating with cold buckwheat noodles and a pork cutlet rice bowl. The narrator agreed but reminded him they needed to get him home on time to avoid any more trouble. Todoroki laughed and kissed the narrator's forehead. The narrator grinned and playfully muttered an affectionate insult. He slipped an arm around the narrator's waist and they left for the nearest restaurant, both buoyed by a sense of relief and happiness the narrator had not felt since before their mother died. A mocha-colored building soon came into view. The narrator challenged Todoroki to a race. He accepted with a mischievous grin and they sprinted through the crowds. The narrator reached the door by a hair and they both laughed, breathing hard, before Todoroki opened the door and offered for the narrator to go first. Inside the restaurant the aroma made their mouths water. A waitress led them to a table, took their water orders, and, as they already knew what they wanted, took their food orders as well, saying the meals would arrive shortly. They spent the rest of lunch joking and eating before heading to the narrator's house to hang out. On the way home Todoroki carried the narrator on his back again. He set the narrator down at the porch so they could unlock the door. With the rest of the household away for internships and classes, they had the house to themselves and the cluster of 13 cats lounging in the living room. They giggled as they made their way to the narrator's bedroom and flopped onto the bed. Lying on their stomachs to catch their breath, they turned to each other and smiled. Todoroki brushed a lock of hair behind the narrator's ear and observed that the narrator was beautiful. The narrator returned the compliment, a little embarrassed. They shared a quiet, affectionate moment together, holding hands and exchanging soft reassurances before settling into comfortable conversation and companionship. Izuku felt his face flush as the morning faded into a quiet, affectionate moment. He and Shoto shared a private, tender moment and then fell asleep on the bed, both dreading the internships the next day. Memories of yesterday lingered as Izuku rushed to get dressed for the internship with his father and Shinszo. His father had walked in on him and Shoto cuddling and reminded them that internships started at 5 a.m. sharp and that whoever arrived last would have to clean the cat litter. Determined not to be the one left with 13 cats worth of mess, Izuku made sure to be fast. He slipped into a turtleneck and joggers and awkwardly pulled on his shoes. The humidity outside bothered him. He disliked the thought of mosquitoes and how their bites itched. He reached the beach in record time and found Shinszo already there with his father. His father greeted him with a smug, mischievous smile and announced that punctuality mattered. Izuku teased that he was 10 minutes early and called his father a hobo, but Shinszo pointed out that he had arrived first, so he set the time. Their father only sipped his coffee and did not answer, and Izuku and his father settled into a glaring match. Shinszo muttered that it was too early for this. They began with a run on the sand. Shinszo was exhausted after 5 minutes, wheezing and bent over, which made Izuku grimace but also feel a bit amused. He patted Shinszo's back and handed him a bottle of water, which Shinszo gratefully drained. When their breathing steadied, their father led them into the caves along the beach. The mouth of one cave was dark, and their father announced a game of hide-and-seek with no quirks allowed. He gave them 30 seconds before he would come looking and push them into the cave. Their father critiqued their hiding the entire time, calling out poor hiding and noisy movements, which eventually made Izuku give up and move on to sparring without quirks, a part of the training he enjoyed. By day's end they were tired and sweaty, and their father looked pleased. The three of them trudged home. Their other parent fussed about mud tracked inside and ordered showers immediately. Izuku smirked and went to shower. The hot water relaxed his muscles and washed away the dirt. He noticed sand lingering in uncomfortable places and sighed. The rest of the week followed with more of their father's unconventional training, though he eased up after the first days. Izuku and Shoto talked every night. Their father planned to let them patrol in Hosu on Saturday, which meant Izuku would see Shoto again. Izuku and Shinszo were excited at the thought of visiting a big city. Izuku had once planned to go to Hosu for his birthday with his mother, and the memory made him frown for a moment before Sho's calm voice pulled him back. Sho told Izuku he had to leave and would see him tomorrow, and Izuku replied that he would. They said their goodbyes and parted. The three boys stepped off the bus into the city. The teens inhaled the unfamiliar city air, not yet noticing an unsettling tang in the smog. Shoyuta hustled them along, saying that his boss was strict about punctuality and that they needed to meet him first before exploring. Izuku stood in awe of the skyline and then began asking a rapid stream of questions about the city's features. Why the subway had escalators instead of stairs, concerns about dark alleys and safety, suggestions that more people should learn self-defense, and the slow patrol coverage in some areas. He wondered aloud how long the massive buildings had taken to construct and whether any were taller than the one they saw. Shinszo, who had also been absorbing the new surroundings and beginning to ask questions, was surprised by some of the facts about the city's size and pace. How could there be something taller than that? The 1,000-foot tower stood in mockery of their ignorance. Shoyuta was glad that the boys' childlike wonder had returned, but he was running out of steam. He turned to them and warned them that they would tire him out before they even started patrolling. The boys nodded and whispered questions to each other, hoping one of them had the answer. They did not notice when they arrived at the Purple Revolution Agency's Hosa building until a man in purple strode out dramatically and greeted Shoyuta warmly, asking who the boys were. Izuku introduced himself as Shuta's son. Shinszo introduced himself as Hitoshi, Shuta's other son. Tears formed at the corners of the eccentric man's eyes as he expressed surprise and delight at the news that Shoyuta had a family. He began to talk about how lovely it would be for the paper and interviews, but Shoyuta quickly clamped a hand over the man's mouth and insisted on keeping the family a secret to avoid danger leaking into their home life. The man relented and promised not to say anything further. He informed Shoyuta that a patrol was scheduled from 5 p.m. to 5 a.m., explained that the agency had been short-handed with recent retirements and hospitalizations, and teased Shoyuta about his appearance, asking him to freshen up. Shoyuta grunted and led them to the hotel. Izuku asked who the man had been, and Shoyuta answered that he was his boss, known as His Purple Highness, though Shoyuta admitted privately that he disliked the hero name. Shoyuta said they would drop off their things at the hotel and then meet Tododeku, which made Izuku beam and quicken his pace. Izuku tossed his bag into the room and sprinted back into the lobby. Shoyuta and Shinszo followed with faint amusement at Izuku's excitement. Izuku searched the crowded streets until he saw red and white hair and ran to tackle Tododeku in a hug. Tododeku was surprised at being tackled but chuckled and patted Izuku's back, calling the display dramatic. Izuku buried himself against Todoroki's neck until Shoyuta had to peel him off. Todoroki accepted Izuku's thanks for the internship and said he would send a good report to their teacher, warning them not to do anything stupid before resuming his patrol. The four had an early dinner at a city ramen house before heading back to the hotel to change into their hero costumes. Todoroki remained in his costume and waited for the others to finish changing. They left the hotel and stepped into the busy streets as the sun began to set. Shoyuta told them to stay close and not to lose him. Izuku clung to Todoroki's sleeve, which Todoroki found amusing. Shoyuta offered practical hero tips about hiding and spotting weaknesses before an enemy could see them. At 8:30, while Shoyuta was demonstrating how to scale a wall using momentum, he suddenly spotted two gnomes a few buildings away. He immediately ordered the boys to stay with him and called for pro heroes to assist, warning them not to engage the monsters. The boys nodded, though Shoto and Shinszo trembled slightly, Shoto from remembering what a Nomu could do and Shinszo from the uncertainty. Izuku, however, stared at the gnomes with burning hatred. Even as backup was summoned, Izuku continued to glare at the creatures. Shoyuta brought the boys to another rooftop and went to help take down the monsters. From the rooftop, Shinszo hesitated but then pointed out a familiar figure below. The boys looked over the edge and saw a man in rags looming over Ida with a sword. Izuku's expression went tense. He did not particularly like Ida, but he did not stand for someone threatening a classmate. Using his wrapped arm, Izuku swung down and kicked the man away. Shoto and Shinszo had no way to get down and could only watch as Izuku confronted the man. Izuku recognized the figure as the ex-vigilante Stain. Stain regarded Izuku with a grim amusement and asked if Izuku was another one of those pretend heroes. Izuku met him with blunt confidence and told Stain that he was himself, not a fake or a true hero. Stain, taken aback by the boy's audacity, received some blunt feedback about his unpleasant smile. The exchange escalated as Stain declared his disappointment and then launched into a swift attack with blades. Izuku rolled and dodged, continuing to taunt that Stain's target was too old to be fighting a teenager he had deemed unworthy. The confrontation became a fast-paced, anime-style clash of moves. Izuku evaded strikes, responded with quick counters, and maneuvered to protect nearby civilians. Stain moved with sharp, precise attacks, and Izuku used agility and resolve to keep the villain at bay until reinforcements arrived and the situation could be brought under control. Izuku winced at his obvious admiration for All Might and told Stain that such selfishness was not the mark of a true hero like All Might. Stain replied that people, heroes included, were flawed and that instead of attacking those he deemed unworthy, Deku should be concerned with those who actually caused harm. Stain argued that wanting money and fame was foolish but not a reason for slaughter, and he pointed to Endeavor as an example of a hero whose abuses and high casualty count deserved scrutiny. Stain went on to say that All Might was not as noble as Deku imagined. He explained that All Might had labeled him villainous, had pushed him to the brink, and had blamed him for his mother's death. Those things, Stain insisted, justified his rage. Deku winced at Stain's bitter words and watched as Stain noted the pitiful state of the pro-hero native. Stain acknowledged that he had a warped sense of justice but reminded Deku that witnesses meant he could not simply walk away. With that, Deku used his shadows to detain Stain, who was too stunned to escape. After securing Stain, Izuku smiled at the captured hero killer, sat down on the concrete, and gave Shinszo and Todoroki a thumbs up to show he was safe. He suggested a conversation, finding Stain's perspective interesting, and asked where it had all begun. Stain sighed and recounted that in high school many of his peers became heroes for money or fame, which offended his ideal of heroism. He said he had tried legal channels, found them ineffective, and had turned to killing so he could force people to confront what he saw as corruption. When Izuku asked whether that had worked, Stain admitted it had not, but insisted he had continued to try to cleanse the hero community. They waited while Native slowly began to regain movement in his fingers. Their quiet was broken when a Nomu crashed toward them and attempted to carry Stain away. Izuku's shadows restrained the creature and he set it down beside Stain. Izuku asked whether Stain knew the people trying to take him. Stain confirmed he did and called them evil, guessing they wanted to recruit him. Izuku asked for details. Stain reluctantly described a leader named Tamura Shigaraki with poor impulse control and anger issues, and a companion called Kurojiri, who kept him steady. He explained that a man with the quirk, decay, could disintegrate anything touched by all 5 fingers, that Kurojiri functioned as a teleportation device, and that the person called Flaky answered to someone he called Master. Stain said he had seen the Master once on a television in the bar the group used as a hideout, then told Deku he had already given too much and that Deku would have to find the rest for himself. Izuku accepted that as fair. Ida and Native showed signs of recovery, and the Nomu continued to screech, but Izuku tightened the shadows around it and ignored the noise. Stain, meanwhile, observed someone standing behind Izuku's friends and warned Izuku to look. Izuku turned and saw the figure Stain had noticed. In a sudden, tense moment, Stain said he might, accidentally, be freed while pretending to help his friends, and his movement to break free confirmed it. He thanked Izuku and told him he would remember, then ran off into the shadows. Shinszo and Todoroki were confused by Stain's escape and Izuku's sudden acceleration. When they turned, they saw the leader of the League of Villains standing with a huge Nomu in jeans. Todoroki moved to freeze the Nomu, but it broke free and threw him over the building and into oncoming traffic. Izuku pushed himself harder using his shadows, heart pounding and sweat on his brow, desperate to get there in time. He extended the shadows to cushion Todoroki's fall but could not catch him fully. He slammed into Todoroki and broke his fall, then noticed a terrible injury to the leg. Izuku stabilized the injured leg the best he could with the shadows, placed Todoroki in a nearby shop, and asked them to contact the Purple Revolution Agency and Eraserhead. He left Todoroki in their care and ran back toward the roof, tensing with every movement. On the roof, Shigaraki crouched over Shinszo, his hand on Shinsu's ankle and his quirk causing the limb to rapidly deteriorate and inflict severe pain. Before Shigaraki could do more, a sudden blast of fire tore him away from Shinszo. Izuku restrained the attacking Nomu and subdued it alongside the others that had been disabled. Izuku heard Native and Ida yelp when the Nomu was dropped down, but all he could focus on was Shigaraki. He struck him again and again until Shigaraki disappeared from under him. He growled and almost lashed out at the hand that landed on his shoulder. Hitoshi Shinszo spoke softly, telling Izuku that he was bleeding and that they needed to get help. Shinszo rarely showed emotion. His foster homes had punished him for it, but this time he could not hold back. Tears tracked down his face and his lip trembled at the sight of his new brother. Izuku was bruised and scraped, with a long cut along one cheek, a badly broken left leg, and serious damage to his hips. Izuku shouted in frustration that the villain had gotten away again and that he felt powerless. Shinszo watched him pull at his hair, then crouched and hugged him despite his own injured ankle. Shinszo told Izuku he was not powerless, reminding him that he had captured 2 Nomus and put up a fierce fight against the leader. Izuku let out a weak laugh at Shinsu's blunt description. When the adrenaline faded, the pain hit Izuku hard and he soon lost consciousness. Shinszo called the heroes. The heroes secured the remaining Nomus, neutralizing Izuku's quirk to do so, and then treated Native and Ida, who pointed them to the rooftop. Detective Tsukachi was surprised to learn that Izuku had captured Nomus again and had taken on Stain. He was disappointed that Stain got away, but he became determined to find out what had happened to the boy. He climbed to the roof with Eraserhead. When Aizawa saw his son's condition, he sank to his knees in tears, muttering no over and over. Tsukachi was disturbed and intrigued. According to Ida and Native, the boy had gotten away without a scratch, so what had caused such severe injuries? He made a mental note to take the case. Tsukachi left Aizawa in the care of medics and moved to the next scene at a nearby store. The owner reported that the boy had come in with a broken leg and asked them to call Eraserhead. Tsukachi found the detail very curious. Time passed. Izuku woke to a bright light and intense pain. He saw his father and Pa, Aunt Mitsuki, Katsuki, Shinszo, Shoto, and some detectives gathered around. Pa rushed forward and hugged him, calling his nickname excitedly. Aizawa gently pulled Pa back. Shoto offered a comforting touch to Izuku's forehead and sat down beside him, taking his hand. Aunt Mitsuki woke from a nap, smiled, and squeezed him tightly. Izuku winced but kept his expression steady. Katsuki scoffed at the display but quieted when his mother shot him a glare. Aunt Mitsuki explained that she had heard from Katsuki that Izuku had been in the hospital and that she had been worried because she had not seen him since he was 9. Detective Tsukachi told Izuku that it was Tuesday. Izuku learned that his injuries had been severe enough to keep him unconscious for 4 days and that the police had questions for him. Everyone stepped outside. Before Aunt Mitsuki left, she gave Izuku her phone number and insisted they have dinner at her house next Tuesday. Izuku laughed until a sharp pain in his side reminded him of his condition. Detective Tsukachi set a recorder on the table and asked Izuku to state his full name and age. Izuku identified himself as Izuku Aizawa, age 16. He hesitated over whether to mention Stain but realized he did not have to include everything. He recounted how his father had spotted a Nomu, how they had moved to another roof, and how he had captured a Nomu that tried to rescue Stain. He omitted the part where he had let Stain go and left out certain details he intended to follow up on himself. He told them how he had saved Shoto and how he had fought the leader. Tsukachi noted Izuku's injuries as he described the fight. When the interview concluded, Tsukachi left and allowed Shoto, Aizawa, Pa, and Shinszo to come back into the room. Izuku asked when he could be discharged. Several days later, Izuku hobbled into class as the bell rang. Aizawa gave a tired nod toward his desk. Izuku moved toward it on crutches, ignoring the hostile glares of a classmate who continued to direct slanderous remarks his way. It was not unexpected. Izuku had sabotaged that classmate's internship application earlier to expose her behavior, and she had since made Tenya Ida her primary target for attention. Izuku made a rude gesture in response and took his seat, glancing at the board where Hitoshi Shinso's name was written. Shinszo sat across the room watching him with a small, smug expression. Izuku stuck his tongue out at Shinszo before turning his attention to the front. Aizawa began explaining the upcoming exams. Izuku had heard the details before and let his mind drift, doodling on his packet. When Aizawa cleared his throat to call him back to attention, Izuku apologized and mimed a salute. The bell rang again and everyone rose for the next PRD except Achiko and Izuku. Izuku's crutches made him wobble when he tried to stand. Achiko muttered that he seemed weak as she left the room. Shoto returned, noticed Izuku's struggle, and offered to help. Izuku smirked at the nickname Shoto used for him and waved him over. I joked that I was in dire need of a horse as Sho carried me on his back to Pa's English class. I announced my presence with a cheerful shout and held my ruler out, grinning. Pa welcomed me and reminded me not to be late next time. I smiled sheepishly at him while Sho gently set me down. The whole class stared. Shinszo wore that same smirk, and I returned it with a glare. I limped to my desk and took notes. At lunch, Sho had to run back for his food, so I stayed on the rooftop with my miso soup. I ladled out the broth and picked a few mushrooms from the surface. From the corner of my eye I saw Kaken approach, looking unusually nervous, more like a kid who had just broken something rather than his usual arrogant self. I greeted him casually and watched him struggle to keep his bravado. He snapped that I should mind my own business, but it was obvious he wanted something. I asked him directly what he wanted, and he admitted that he wanted me not to tell Auntie Mitsuki about middle school, that he wanted me to pretend they had simply drifted apart. I questioned him, pointing out that it would be a lie to hide years of torment. He reacted with shame and tightened his hands until his knuckles were white. I declined to dwell on his discomfort and agreed to keep the secret. He looked surprised when I said yes. Shoto walked onto the roof and immediately sensed the tension. He asked if I was all right. I smiled, set my food down, and hugged him, pressing a quick, affectionate kiss to the bridge of his nose before stepping back. I told Shoto that Kaken had asked me to keep the bullying secret, and Shoto raised an eyebrow as he opened his lunch. I confirmed that I had agreed, and we ate together in comfortable silence. As the day wound down, I prepared for the confrontation waiting in the classroom. I gave Sho a look that meant wait for me outside and that I might need backup. I also silently requested a comforting kiss afterward, so I sent him a text to make sure he understood. When everyone left, Uraraka stood with her arms crossed and confronted me, accusing me of reckless behavior that had caused Tenya to get hurt and required Aizawa to intervene. I explained that it had actually been Tenya acting dangerously and that I had not been the one responsible. She reacted by slapping me. I steadied myself and used my shadows to keep her from escalating the situation. I gathered my things and my crutches, walked over to her, delivered a sharp, controlled push to her shin, called her a nerd as a parting barb, and ran from the classroom. Sho watched my triumphant expression and asked quietly whether she was all right. I told him she was, and we moved on. Later, I laughed theatrically about the small victory, admitting that it felt like classic villainous glee to have kicked her and called her a nerd. Shoto stared at me in disbelief, and I insisted that it had been the best small triumph I could remember. Sometime later, Shoto and I stopped at a coffee shop before going to my house. Dad had left a note saying he and Pa were going on a date, which meant Sho would be the one to change my bandages and might see my scars. I briefly considered asking Shinszo for help, then dismissed the idea when I remembered how sensitive he was about seeing me in bandages. I realized I had no choice but to tell Sho myself. We sat through an awkward romance movie. While Sho went to get popcorn, I worried over how to tell him about my self-harm. I wished I could keep it secret, but I knew that was impossible. When he returned and settled beside me, he noticed my distance and asked what was wrong. I asked him to promise not to break up with me, then immediately regretted the frightened comment. He looked concerned, gently cupped my face, and reassured me that he would never leave me, his voice steady but soft. I let myself believe him for a moment and leaned into the comfort he offered as we faced whatever came next together. Tears pricked at my eyes when he spoke with quiet sincerity. I hugged him tightly, still not ready to tell him everything. He asked what was wrong. I stood and removed my shirt. Between the bandages, scars littered my body. Some were from Kaken, but others were clearly from self-harm. I pointed to the most prominent ones on my arms and admitted that I struggled with self-harm, that I wanted him to know before he rewrapped my wounds. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out weak. Shoto immediately pulled me into a firm, reassuring embrace and told me I was not a freak, that this did not change how he felt about me. Hearing him say he loved me made my breath hitch. He seemed to realize what he had revealed and flushed, but he held me close. I returned his affection and told him I loved him too. He finished rewrapping my hips and back and then asked practical, caring questions about what calmed me, what triggered me, and how he could help. The concern and attentiveness made me feel both foolish for my earlier hesitation and unexpectedly giddy. When he asked if he could stay over, I thought for a moment and agreed. We lay together on my bed. He soon drifted into sleep while I checked my phone and found a new message from an unknown number that simply said they needed to talk. Later, in the morning, Izuku shifted into his own perspective and felt the rush of family chaos around him. His father urged everyone to hurry so they would not be late for dinner with the Bakugas. Pa fretted about appearances. The real worry, Izuku thought, should be Auntie and Kaken fighting or bringing up Mom. At the hospital, Auntie had learned that Mom was dead, and she had been devastated. According to Kaken, she found out after inviting Izuku over and had cried for hours. Izuku reflected that although Kaken had bullied him and they had drifted apart, absence had not erased affection. Izuku pulled a dark gray turtleneck on and waited by the front door while Recovery Girl's work left his broken leg reduced to a slight limp. He and Shinszo sat by the door as their fathers fussed, and Izuku turned his attention to Shinszo to break the tense atmosphere. He asked what Shinszo thought of Class 1A. Shinszo smirked and called it a class full of idiots. When Izuku teased him about any particular person of interest, a faint, almost imperceptible blush crossed Shinsu's cheeks. Shinszo denied it and covered his face, leaving Izuku intrigued and planning to question him later. The fathers finally sorted themselves out and left. The humid air outside held the buzz of mosquitoes as Izuku checked his messages and remembered the mysterious text from the night before. Once alert and less tired, the message mattered to him. He reviewed the exchange in his head. A mysterious contact had reached out, then revealed himself as Stain. Their banter had been familiar and rough around the edges. Stain teased and made a dramatic, familiar threat in the kind of old rival tone he used for effect. After the theatrics, Stain reported that Krusty had established a second base and was involved in suspicious activity that looked like a breeding ground for those monstrous birds. Izuku absorbed the news, his expression going blank as worry and resolve settled in. Shinszo noticed the change and quietly asked if he was all right, and Izuku forced himself to answer that he was fine. As they left the house, Izuku thought about putting his coding skills to use again. Their family prepared to face the evening ahead. Pa and Dad finally took a breath before heading out. Izuku described the Bakugas to them. Auntie Mitsuki was similar to Kaken but had more control most of the time. Masaru came across as a pushover, the opposite of his sister and of Kaken, and Kaken himself was, as always, infuriating. His father and Pa nodded, understanding Izuku's frustration even if they did not know the full extent of how difficult Kaken could be. Izuku had never told anyone the extent of what that BSTRD had put him through, not even Shoyuta. The Aizawas arrived at the Bakugas 5 minutes late. Hisashi had been sent into hysterics, but Shoyuta eventually calmed him. Shoyuta led everyone to the door and knocked. Mitsuki greeted them with a smile and promptly ushered them into the house, introducing herself and Masaru before cutting herself off when she realized Katsuki was not present. Mitsuki called down for her son in a suddenly loud voice, and even Hisashi flinched at the volume. Katsuki answered from upstairs with a rude retort, protesting being rushed. Katsuki stormed down the staircase and looked the group over, ping his head in confusion and asking since when any of them were related. Izuku explained that Shoyuta and Hisashi had adopted him at the beginning of the year and had recently adopted Shinszo, and asked if Katsuki had not been paying attention. Katsuki, ears cleaned, wondered why he would have cared. Mitsuki shoved him lightly and reminded them that they used to be best friends, asking what had happened to decency. Izuku thought that decency had been thrown out the window a long time ago. Mitsuki invited the visitors to look around and mentioned that dinner would be ready in a few minutes, then asked Katsuki to show everyone around. She gave him a sharp look before dragging her husband to the kitchen. Shoyuta and Hisashi went to look at the family pictures on the wall, some showing a toddler Izuku. The boys turned their attention to Katsuki. He put on a tough act, but his eyes betrayed him. He told them to look around themselves with a sneer and implied they should remember the way around the house. Izuku returned a sweet, overly polite smile and claimed he had forgotten the memories he had made there, teasing that maybe Katsuki could help him remember. Katsuki's eye twitched while Shinszo watched the exchange. There was something Izuku was not saying about Katsuki. A notification sound interrupted Katsuki. He picked up his phone to type, a blush creeping across his cheeks. Shinszo noted with dry amusement that whoever Katsuki was texting had quieted him within seconds and teased that it might be a girlfriend. The prospect visibly unsettled Katsuki, and Shinszo pushed the tease further by suggesting it might be a boyfriend. Katsuki lunged at Shinszo, shouting a violent threat. Shoyuta saw the lunge and neutralized Katsuki's quirk, reminding them there would be no quirks after school. Katsuki flipped off the teacher and stormed into the hallway. Izuku watched the scene with faint amusement. When Mitsuki called that food was ready, everyone gathered at the table except Katsuki, who had to be coaxed out of his room. Mitsuki scolded him to be nice for their company, and he barked back insults. Mitsuki, with a small miracle, had gotten him off his phone and shoved him into his seat, then smiled and welcomed everyone to eat. Mitsuki had made spicy curry. Everyone enjoyed it except Hisashi, who began to cry as soon as it touched his lips because it was so hot. Masaru hurriedly brought him milk, which Hisashi gratefully chugged, and ended up with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich since the Bakugas did not have anything milder. Masaru sent Hisashi an apologetic look and proceeded to tell an embarrassing story about meeting Mitsuki's parents. He had been served very spicy ramen, had reacted poorly, and had almost passed out after choking on the milk he was given. Mitsuki snorted at the memory. Katsuki sat glaring through the parade of embarrassing stories about him and Izuku. A familiar pain bloomed in his chest whenever he heard how well they had gotten along and how kind Izuku had been. Izuku leaned back and watched Katsuki's inner turmoil. He sipped his water and continued eating. Izuku and Shinszo sat together at the end of the table, sending each other knowing looks. If Katsuki said something foolish, they exchanged private amusement. If an adult said something embarrassing, they shared the awkwardness. To an outsider it might have looked like telepathy, but it was simply silent, practiced communication born of shared experiences. The silent rapport made Katsuki increasingly uneasy, so he tried to start a conversation by asking if they were ready for the exams the next day. Izuku said he thought he had a good chance of passing, trailing off as he exchanged another look with Shinszo. Katsuki asked what they were doing and called it creepy. Shinszo gave him a pointed look and, with dry humor, pretended they were aliens trying to overthrow humankind. Izuku muttered under his breath that Katsuki's theatrics served them well, which only deepened Katsuki's confusion. By the end of the night, the adults were happy and slightly tipsy. Mitsuki, overcome with nostalgia, became a sad drunk and began to cry about an old friend. Shoyuta and Hisashi sat awkwardly while Masaru comforted his wife, brushing her hair and smiling sheepishly at the pro-hero couple. Masaru suggested it had been a lovely dinner but that they should head home, and the family of four saw them out. In the car afterward, Hisashi struggled to describe the emotional roller coaster the dinner had been. Izuku swore in surprise, prompting Hisashi to scold him for his language as he tried to keep their car steady. Shinszo glanced up from his phone, and Izuku deadpanned that it was his turn to handle the cat litter duty. Izuku gave Shinszo a playful kick to the shin and called him a loser, which made Shinszo shout back in protest. The adults interjected with a brief chiding for their language, and the ride continued home. The night ended quietly, with the group reflecting on the evening and the complicated threads that tied them together. Deku took a while to fully wake. He had foolishly set his alarm for 3 in the morning to get extra time to train for the exams that day. He tried to move toward the training room as quietly as possible, but the people in the house seemed to have super hearing in the morning. He thought it was a miracle, given how often Pa had probably blasted eardrums in the past. The training room was at the far end of the house, so navigating in the dark was a struggle. He groaned when he nearly tripped over a cat. He was tempted to toss the cat aside and sprint to the indoor gym, but he gritted his teeth and continued carefully. After a couple of stubbed toes and a string of curse words, I had made it into the training room. I started stretching. It felt eerie with no other sounds in the house, but I ignored the silence and warmed up. When my body finally loosened, I practiced a few kicks while keeping my shadows encircled around me. During the months at UA, I had realized how much years of neglect had affected my control. It had been Shinso's idea to try using it while distracted, and so far it had worked. The exam had no idea what was coming. After 2 hours, people began to wake. Dad was the first. He asked if I was practicing for the test. I nodded as I destroyed a mannequin. He invited me to spar, and I paused to consider. When I asked the time, he checked his watch and said it was 5. I agreed to spar on the condition that he make me coffee afterward, and he accepted with a teasing remark. I felt my quirk rise, ready to attack, knowing Dad would erase it as soon as I began, so I had only a few seconds to make an impact. I lunged forward and hit him in the chest with a blast, startling him. I bounced back and aimed for his legs, forming a whip to sweep them from beneath him. Grinning, I continued the assault, ran up, and formed a shadow ball in my hands. As I closed in, the shadow dissipated into the surroundings. Dad sprang up and responded with a barrage of quick punches. His experience showed, his fists were a blur. I struggled at first, then found his pattern and used it to throw him over onto the mat. My quirk returned and I wove shadow tendrils into a loose restraint around his wrist. I declared victory, and he called me every insult in the book with a laugh. Pa and Shinszo appeared in the doorway, urging everyone to be polite. Pa swatted me out of the room and sat me at the table where he had made coffee and bacon. He pointed out that Dad had gotten out of coffee duty this time and warned that I would not be so lucky next time. I chugged the coffee even as it burned, which horrified Pa, who reminded me that coffee was meant to be enjoyed. I teased him about his taste and went to get dressed in my uniform. As Shinszo and I left the house, Pa reminded us that his concert was tomorrow. Shinszo and I took the long way to school. He asked if he thought he would pass the exam, and I told him he probably would. He had grown strong under Hobo's training. I punched him lightly in the shoulder and teased him about being distracted by a secret crush. He shoved my face away and insisted there was no one, muttering under his breath and calling me nosy. I walked into the classroom with a skip. Uraraka looked at me, probably still annoyed, but I didn't care. Sho sat on the top of my desk, head tilted back and peaceful. I reached up and gave a brief, affectionate touch to his cheek. He opened his eyes slowly and smiled at me, greeting me warmly. He ruffled my hair as he always did. I had tried to tame it that morning, but Shoto's gestures often undid it. He asked if I was ready for the day, and I told him I always was. He teased me about how many broken bones I'd had so far. I protested that counting them didn't mean I wasn't ready. He argued that it did, and I joked about breaking more for his sake, which made him roll his eyes. He called my recklessness romantic in a teasing way, and even suggested we elope as a joke. Shoto then grew more serious. He touched my cheek gently and warned me not to break any more bones, looking dark for a moment and making it clear he would be very upset if I did. I nodded and tried to calm him, and he smiled before checking the time and telling me it was time to go. He left for his seat with a small show of affection. The bell rang and Dad walked to the board to announce the exam. He reminded everyone that it would be difficult without study, glancing at Kaminari and Kirishima as he spoke. Written portion easy and turned it in with 10 minutes left. I used the remaining time to think about the new LOV hideout, planning to try my old hacking skills and maybe get Momo to make a tracker. My thoughts broke off when Dad announced the end of the test. I noticed Kaminari tense up and watched Shinszo look his way with quiet interest. Students moved to the physical exam area. The instructions were simple: apprehend or escape a teacher. I discovered I was partnered with Kaken. He regarded me with faint disgust. He started to stomp over, but Kirishima stepped in, whispering something that calmed him. I motioned for Sho to come closer and pointed out the scene with a teasing observation about Kaken's love. Sho raised an amused eyebrow. The day continued with the same blend of rivalry, training, and small, sharp moments of care that threaded through our lives. Love wasn't the problem. It was the mix of an inferiority complex and a superiority complex, and the complications from bad parenting. Sho reached up and petted my head. He apologized, explaining that it was because my hair was so fluffy. I giggled and leaned into him. Our conversation ended quickly because Shoto had to go first. He was up against my father, and I could tell my father was going to make this difficult. He was still salty about us dating. I told Shoto good luck and he thanked me. Shoto ran into the arena while I watched his fight on one of the wall-size screens. Jairu stood beside me. I tensed when I noticed how close Shoto was to Momo. Mina bounded in with snacks and asked why we both looked so tense. Jairu answered with confusion and Mina laughed, insisting she could feel the tension and teasing me about being agitated. Mina asked if it was Todoroki that I was worried about, and I said it wasn't him. I didn't want Momo to get the wrong idea about Shoto. Mina asked if Shoto was available. I said no, and when she asked for details, revealed that Shoto and I were dating. Mina admitted she had been distracted by other things and hadn't noticed. Jairu and I exchanged a shrug while Mina wandered off looking both pleased and a little disappointed with herself. Jairu pointed out that Mina had left her chips behind, and I grabbed a bag and munched as the fight continued. The match was rough. Aizawa-sensei moved with a cold efficiency. When Jairu heard me call Aizawa-sensei Dad, she connected the dots: my injury at USJ, the way he had reacted, and the fact we shared a last name. She asked me not to tell anyone, and I agreed. When she asked about my mother, I said she was dead. Jairu offered a quiet apology and patted my back. On the screen, my father became surrounded by flames and the referees closed in. When they handcuffed him, Jairu and I shared a small, relieved high five. I walked over to Shoto after his match. He smiled and hugged me, and I teased him about being sweaty. He apologized and stepped back. I complimented his performance and suggested we make katsudon later. He nodded, then said he was going to take a shower and pressed a quick, affectionate kiss to the top of my head before leaving. Mina crowded in, declaring us adorable and confessing surprise that she had never noticed us as a couple. After a bit of small talk that felt a little intense, I slipped away. I found Shinszo talking with Kaminari and leaned in with a smirk to see what they were up to. Kaminari greeted me happily and asked what I wanted. Shinszo gave me a tired look, and I teased him, waggling my eyebrows. He returned my gesture with a flat expression, and I decided to leave them to their conversation. In a corner, Kirishima and Siro were loudly arguing over ridiculous survival theories, joking about whether someone could survive on extreme, improvised rations alone. They debated the logistics with over-the-top enthusiasm, dragging me into the absurdity. Kaken loomed over us and asked what we were discussing. I told him the summary, and he reacted with disbelief. He then reminded me that our team would be up next, and when I asked who we were facing he said All Might. Kaken and I drifted toward the arena entrance together. He asked why I seemed to dislike All Might so much. I told him I had reasons and that I didn't owe him an explanation. I accused him of not understanding the whole history, how things had happened to me and how Kaken had vanished for a time and then returned with a new place in life. I demanded to know what had happened, but the buzzer sounded before Kaken could keep justifying himself with his usual self-righteous speech. The test would judge both speed and teamwork, so taking All Might down alone was not an option. I needed Kaken to cooperate with me. Izuku suggested curtly that they stage a simulated fight to raise their scores. Bakugo immediately insisted that he would handle it himself, fuming and making it clear he would not let Izuku interfere. Izuku thought desperately that someone needed to save him. Bakugo threatened that if his scores suffered because of Izuku, he would make Izuku regret it. Izuku told Bakugo not to make things worse and warned him to stop letting pride get in the way. Bakugo refused, and Izuku muttered that he would let him have his way. They headed to the mock city with Bakugo kept close by a shadow leash. Bakugo screamed all the way, and Izuku did his best to ignore him. When they rounded the corner, All Might stood where they had hoped. Izuku announced that they had found him and reminded Bakugo that they would follow the plan. They would stage a fight, Izuku would try to take All Might down, and Bakugo would handcuff him afterward. Bakugo scoffed and called the plan stupid, warning that All Might was too strong. Izuku reminded him that he had managed difficult opponents before and told him not to worry. All Might collected himself and warned the two students not to try to handcuff him. Bakugo exploded with an insult, and All Might lunged. Bakugo held his own at first, but it was clear he was getting overwhelmed. Izuku moved in to help, delivering a quick kick that momentarily distracted All Might. The veteran hero's surprise showed, and he shifted his focus toward Izuku. Izuku changed the tempo of his attacks after a while. All Might adjusted to the new rhythm quickly, remarking that the technique would not be enough against him. Izuku, frustrated, used the tendrils of his shadows to slam All Might into the ground and held him pinned, pressing a foot to keep him from rising. Izuku leaned close and delivered a cold taunt to shake the heroes. Composure. Bakugo, still a little stunned, reminded Izuku about the cuffs. Bakugo then took out the restraints and secured them to All Might, grunting before storming off. Izuku released All Might, who stood clutching his midsection and warned that what they had done was unwise. Izuku mocked the reaction lightly and reminded All Might that he was lucky not to be expelled. All Might said he would remember the lesson, and Izuku moved on to look for Todoroki. When Izuku found Todoroki, he barreled into him. Todoroki mentioned that he had just showered, and Izuku asked for a hug. Todoroki obliged, and Izuku muffled a complaint about Bakugo into Todoroki's chest. Todoroki hummed comfortingly. Izuku then asked Todoroki to take a shower, and Todoroki suggested freshening up instead. They agreed to go their separate ways to prepare. Todoroki gave Izuku a quick affectionate pat and nudged him toward the locker room, and Izuku skipped off toward the showers. After classes ended, Izuku convinced Todoroki to come to his house so Todoroki could help make katsudon. At Izuku's house, Todoroki sat on the counter watching as Izuku prepared the ingredients. Izuku encouraged Todoroki to help, and Todoroki offered to put the pork in the pan, promising he probably could not mess it up. Izuku teased that he had baking soda ready in case anything went wrong, and Todoroki said a fire would only happen if Izuku made things too hot. When it was time to cook, Izuku handed Todoroki the panko-covered pork. The meat sizzled as Todoroki placed it in the pan, and Todoroki smiled at Izuku in a way that made Izuku think it was adorable. Izuku handed the next piece to Todoroki with a teasing flourish, and Todoroki stuck his tongue out before taking it. They finished the meal and settled on the couch to play Mario Kart. Shinszo popped in briefly to get more coffee, and Izuku teased him, claiming to have figured out Shinsu's secret crush. Shinszo threatened jokingly that he would murder Izuku and chased him around the house. Izuku abandoned his controller and food and dodged Shinszo, while Todoroki laughed and said they couldn't let Shinszo catch him. Izuku called out a playful retort and told Shinszo he needed Izuku alive for a reason, and Izuku mockingly told the intruder to be gone. Shinszo asked Todoroki with a grin if he could just land a light punch, but Todoroki refused, saying he could not allow Izuku to be bruised on his watch. Shinszo smiled and momentarily stunned Todoroki with his presence, and then in the ensuing chaos Izuku ended up on the floor with a shoe mark on his cheek from the playful scuffle. Izuku laughed it off and asked why he always had to provoke people. Todoroki crouched and sighed at Izuku's antics, wondering what to do with his friend. They cleaned up the living room and retreated to Izuku's room, where Izuku steered the conversation into astrophysics. Izuku asked Todoroki how anything could enter a black hole if time stopped at the event horizon. Todoroki blinked at the question and replied that matter gets pulled in, and Izuku continued to press the paradox about time. Todoroki tried to answer with practical examples, and Izuku playfully launched into another hypothetical about an elevator in space, prompting Todoroki to react and the two to carry on their usual banter as they explored weird and interesting questions late into the evening. Shoto told Izuku that he was going to break his brain. Izuku looked down at Shoto's hand, then up at him, smiling as he teased that Shoto should not dare. Izuku smiled and liked Shoto's hand. Shoto wiped the saliva on his uniform and called it gross. Izuku shrugged that he could not help it. Shoto stopped him with a gentle gesture, and they shared a quiet, affectionate moment. Izuku pushed Shoto away playfully and hit him with a pillow, teasing him as he did. Shoto felt a warm flutter at the closeness and pulled Izuku into a brief, friendly hug. They parted with smiles. Shoto blurted that he loved Izuku. Izuku returned the sentiment and sat close, leaning against him. Shoto smiled in bliss and wished he could stay like that forever. After Shoto left, Deku went to his computer. Earlier that day he had managed to get a tracker from Momo after a lot of convincing. The only problem left was finding the base Stain's hint would help, but Stain had left Deku to his own devices for now. For hours Deku scoured the internet for any trace the League might have left. He found nothing. There were no mentions of Tamura Shigaraki. He could not understand how the League had managed to gather an army for the USJ incident without leaving some online trace. Frustrated and tired, Deku groaned, rubbed his face, and pulled out his phone to message Stain. He messaged Stain asking for at least a hint. Stain replied by asking why he was up so late. Deku explained that he needed help finding the base. Stain responded that this was a training exercise and posed no immediate threat, so Deku would have to find it on his own. Deku turned off his phone and tossed it across the room, groaning and rubbing his face. He grabbed a jacket and decided to go for a walk. He closed the door carefully and stepped into the cool night air, hood up so he looked like a dark shape in the street. Before he had been adopted there had been no one to be proud of him, no one to be disappointed in him, no one to cry for him. He had been alone. Now he had a family who cared, and that thought scared him. Using his quirk, he floated above the neighborhood. Adrenaline rushed through him as he climbed higher than he normally dared. He smiled. He missed the anonymity of being alone. For a moment he was just another person in the night. He took a deep breath and let himself fall, feeling the air whip past him before he used his quirk to slow and float gently down. His heart pounded, his hair was messy, his hands were sweaty. He felt alive. He flew higher still, paused to look down at the road below, then released his quirk and dropped again, letting the rush take him. Each time he pulled himself back up with his power, lowering into a soft float, he felt a little freer. After a while he pulled his hoodie down, ran his fingers through his hair, and headed into the city. He slipped through alleys and avoided trouble, passing the occasional drunken argument and groups looking for a fight. When he reached a dead end he jumped up onto the rooftops and sat cross-legged, watching the city buzz below. It felt as lively as daytime. Eventually he moved on, edging along the roof like a tightrope and then slipping down into a shady bar. Shadows helped him blend in as he took a seat in a corner and sipped a whiskey he'd taken from an unattended table. The first sip made him GG, but he kept drinking, telling himself it did not matter, he would be forgotten eventually. The bartender noticed and asked what he was doing there. Deku admitted he was not sure why he was there. The bartender sighed and said he did not want to call the police and advised him to leave and not come back until he was older. Deku stuck his tongue out in response and left. Outside, the sun was rising. Deku's buzz faded and reality hit him. His breath caught. He stumbled into an alleyway, pulled at his hair in frustration, and feared his father's reaction. He cursed to himself, knowing he was in trouble. I panicked at the sudden shock and shot into the air, flying home as fast as I could. By the time I got back it was 4 in the morning. I climbed in through my bedroom window and exhaled when I noticed no one was up. I sniffed my clothes and realized I still smelled like the bar. I stripped off my clothes and took a long shower. The warm water ran over my skin as I threw up repeatedly. I crawled out of the shower and grabbed my phone. I ignored messages from Stain and called Sho. Sho answered and asked if I was okay. I giggled and tried to sound fine, telling him I loved him before ending the call and getting dressed, ignoring his return calls. I walked to Shinszo's room and knocked. He paused when he saw me, grabbed my arm and pulled me inside. He stared me up and down, asking what had happened to me. I tried to play it off and told him I might have gone into the city and ended up at a bar. He scolded me, calling me a problem child and asking what we were going to do. I sat on his bed while he paced. Shinszo listed our options, starting with telling Dad and Pa, which he dismissed. He suggested pretending I just had a rough night that might be misinterpreted. I agreed to that plan. Shinszo scrambled to get the trash can for me and I was sick again. When I looked up, he asked where my makeup was. I grabbed his wrist and skipped to my room, finding the makeup bag and forgetting what else was in it. Shinszo opened the bag and held up a set of razors I had hidden. I hiccuped and tried to hush him, asking him not to tell anyone. Shinszo told me I was a mess and took charge, placing concealer under my eyes and smoothing my hair. He asked if I had anything that smelled. I clumsily found a body spray and smiled, pleased with the small victory. He told me to get dressed and put it on. He left the razors with him. I didn't notice. I sobered up a bit as I changed and called Sho again. Sho checked on me and I promised to explain at school. I told him Shinszo had been there and that Dad and Pa couldn't find out. I said I loved him and hung up when he did. Pa was making pancakes when I came down. He greeted me cheerfully. Dad asked if I was okay because I looked wrecked. I lied that I had a nightmare. Pa rushed over to ask if I wanted to talk, but I laughed it off and took the plate of pancakes he offered, forcing myself to eat. Pa reminded me about his concert that night before I left with Shinszo. Shinszo warned me he would never let me live this down. After a few minutes of silence he smirked and teased me. When we arrived at the classroom, Shoto ran over and hugged me, bluntly telling me I looked awful. He asked what had happened. I admitted I had gotten drunk at a bar and left once I realized what I was doing. Shoto's expression went blank in a familiar, unsettling way. He told me we would talk later and left. I sat staring at my trembling hands, wondering if I had ruined everything. At lunch, Shoto was nowhere to be found. I ate alone on the roof, ignoring tears and the panic rising in me. My head felt fuzzy and everything seemed wrong. Standing was difficult. My movements felt sluggish and heavy. Eventually I sat down and did nothing. I wasn't sure how long I sat before Shinszo came up. I couldn't hear his voice clearly, I could only look at his mouth moving. He said I looked strange and tried to pick me up. I tried to help but couldn't move. After a while he gave up and fetched Dad. They hurried around like frantic people until Dad picked me up and brought me to Recovery Girl. Everything became a blur. I thought Kaken and maybe Shoto had visited, I couldn't tell. As I slowly regained control, I looked around and realized the school day was over. Recovery Girl asked if I was lucid again and sighed about having worked so much overtime. She told me Dad was waiting in his office. I walked to Dad's office and told him I was alive. He looked up from his papers and asked if I was all right. After an awkward silence, he closed his work and mentioned that Todoroki wanted to see me after I finished with that episode. I agreed and asked him to drop me off. Dad dropped me off and I stood at Shoto's door. It took him a moment to muster the courage to knock, but he did. Shoto's sister opened the door and said she would get Shoto. He smiled and nodded. Shoto emerged wearing a shirt and gray sweatpants and invited him into his room. He nodded and followed silently. They sat on the bed. Shoto, speaking quietly, asked why he made him worry so much. He began to answer, but Shoto cut him off with a raised hand and said he could not help if he did not open up. Shoto admitted it haunted him that while he had been out getting drunk, Shoto had slept peacefully like an idiot. Tears rolled down Shoto's face. He walked over and wiped them away. Shoto recalled visiting Recovery Girl earlier and finding him staring blankly as if he did not recognize anyone, and asked him to please talk. He hugged Shoto and whispered into his neck that he would. Shoto thanked him and hugged him back. Later, back at home, everyone was watching a documentary when his father noticed him and asked if he was all right. He reassured his father that he was fine and that it had only been an episode. His father and Hitoshi had made lasagna and invited him to sit. He accepted and watched the documentary as they ate. The lasagna was good, and he thanked his father. When he went up to his room, the smell of alcohol made him scrunch his nose. He threw his clothes in the washer and cleaned his room as best he could, then hid his computer in a drawer. He would have to resume his search later, otherwise he would go insane. He opened his phone and stared at the messages from Stain. Stain had sent several messages over the night, offering a hint that it was a warehouse, asking if he was ignoring him, checking if he was okay, and warning him not to die. He sighed and responded that he was alive and thanked Stain for the hint, teasing him by calling him Granny. Stain asked where he had been. He replied that he had been at a bar. Stain told him he had been lucky not to have been killed, and berated him as a lousy kid. He answered by telling Stain to calm down, reminding him that the last time he had seen him he had the upper hand. The exchange ended with Stain swearing and wishing him good night. He replied casually and put his phone away. He fell asleep easily, tired from the day. He felt a little excited about shopping for training camp next week. It felt like it might be fun. He decided there was never enough time. Staring into the mirror, he traced the scars that littered his body, eyes lingering on the ones at his hips. He never minded most of his scars, but the marks from Shigaraki still made him burn with anger. He pulled on his clothes as quickly as he could, wincing when he touched his hips. He wondered if there was a quirk that could heal scars, adjusted his sweatshirt, gave himself one last look, and went to sit on the couch. His father had rescheduled his band's set for tonight, the day after his mental breakdown. He had heard his father sing before and knew he kept improving. The bandmates were nice enough, though he kept his slight dislike to himself for his father's sake. His father was already at the venue. He was just waiting for his father to feed the cats and for Hitoshi to finish dressing. He checked the news and saw a headline announcing that the hero killer Stain had returned. The report showed a crazed picture and said Stain had been targeting criminals, taking down robbers and attackers. He smirked and texted Stain, teasing that the student had taken his teacher's advice. Stain replied by asking for one peaceful night. He replied no, then turned his phone off. A cat leapt at Hitoshi, and Hitoshi swore as the animal clung to him. He scolded Hitoshi for his language and laughed as he pried the cat, Aslan, off Hitoshi. He cooed at the cat, praised its sweetness, and set it down. Hitoshi pinched his arm and complained, but they left for the car with his father leading the way. When they arrived at the concert venue, it was nearly full. His father might not have been the top singer in the area, but his hero status drew a crowd. He looked around the room with mild disdain. It promised to be an annoying night, but he settled in. He watched the stage where his father and his bandmates had been preparing songs for months. As they were finally ready, his father walked out with the other band members and smiled excitedly. His normally spiked-up hair was let down and had a slight wave to it, and if one looked carefully there was some smudged eyeliner. The audience cheered with a deafening roar. It seemed as though every concert brought 30 more people in. Pa grabbed the mic and looked back to the drummer waiting for the count-off. The drummer smiled and slammed his drumsticks down. When he crashed down, the music began. He bobbed his head along to the fast drum beat. The song was intense, full of dramatic metaphors about being a hero that he found a little amusing. When it finished, Pa thanked the audience and moved into the next song. The guitarist, Furuta, stepped forward and joined Pa. Their voices together were beautiful. The tempo slowed for a slightly more reflective song, and midway through a guitar solo delivered one of the best riffs he had ever heard. When it ended, Furuta stepped back and pulled her hair up into a bun. Pa took a long breath and began an a cappella introduction. Slowly the other instruments returned. It was beautiful, but its meaning became clear quickly. The song was about the USJ and Hosu incidents. He felt guilty when he saw tears form in Pa's eyes, and when he looked around he saw that no one in the audience had dry eyes. By the end of Pa's set he had been so engrossed in the music that he hadn't even noticed it ending. He finally stood when everyone else began screaming. He jumped up, clapped as loud as he could, and cheered for Pa. Pa bowed, thanked everyone for coming, and then motioned the group backstage. They left and went around the building to the back, where a few vans Pa had rented waited. Inside, Pa and his bandmates were drinking and laughing. The drummer turned toward him, smiling broadly, and called him kiddo while walking over and ruffling his hair. He restrained a glare. The drummer then slung an arm over his shoulder, which made him look for an excuse to leave, but his dad and Shinszo were talking in the corner and Pa was speaking with the bassist. The drummer offered to show his new pack of playing cards, his breath carrying the scent of alcohol. Furuta smiled and waved as they passed. She greeted him warmly by name and asked how the concert had been. She threaded her thick black hair through her fingers and asked if Suzumura had been bothering him with his card collection. Furuta's bracelets banged as she pulled him over and told Suzumura to show him the cards, mentioning that Suzumura hadn't shown them yet. Suzumura rolled his eyes and left to fetch them. Furuta gave him a kind smile, her eyes crinkling with blurred eyeliner, and leaned against the wall. She asked, with easy teasing, whether he had anything going on in his life since they had last met: trips, friend drama, girlfriends, or boyfriends. He looked up from the ground and said that he had a boyfriend. Furuta asked whether his boyfriend treated him well. He said yes, smiling at the thought of Shoto. Furuta smiled and offered some quick, blunt advice about not letting anyone take advantage of him. Her phone then rang. She read the notification and said that her girlfriend had arrived. She hugged him quickly and left, her cheap perfume lingering in the air. He wiped his shirt and walked over to Pa. Told him they would be leaving soon. Mishima, the brash guitarist, addressed him with a nickname and asked if he had seen Mishima's solo and whether it had been good. He answered shortly, not wanting to talk much. Mishima laughed and teased him about being quiet. Pa sighed happily at the exchange. Pa and the others discussed how the second song had been especially good, and then they decided to get some ramen. He agreed. Suzumura found him again and presented the new deck of cards, explaining that it was a Pro Hero limited edition with Endeavor as the Joker. He snorted at Endeavor's depiction but smiled lightly when Suzumura said he had made him smile. Suzumura shuffled through the deck, showing each card. He frowned a little at All Might being the King's card, though it made sense given the reverence people had for him. Suzumura looked at him expectantly, waiting for a response, and he admitted that he liked the cards. Pa called out that they were leaving, so he waved goodbye and moved toward his dad's. Pa wrapped a hand around his shoulder and asked if he had enjoyed the concert. He told Pa he had liked the second song the most. Shoyuta also said he thought it had been good. Somewhere else, a small group of conspirators argued in tense, sharp tones about their plan and the necessity of removing a particular obstacle immediately. One member warned that if the plan failed there would be severe consequences, and the others agreed that they knew where to strike to ensure it hurt. Before long, the day of the camp arrived. The haze of excitement made the days blur past, and suddenly they were boarding the bus. He sat next to Shudo in the window seat. Shudo had brought snacks for them to share. Shudo gave him a small smile and nodded, and as the bus took off Shudo's grip on his thighs tightened and white began to bloom on his knuckles. He reached over and took Shudo's hand, holding it. Shudo flinched at the touch. He asked if something was wrong, and Shudo reassured him that he was fine. He offered some Pocky sticks, and I asked if he was sure as I took a few out of the box. He said not to worry, but I nodded without believing him. Shudo had been on edge all week. He kept scanning our surroundings, and if he heard a sound he would tense as if ready to fight something unseen. I sighed, knowing Shudo would only speak when he wanted to, and it was frustrating. The bus ride was awkward and dull. Shudo stayed silent the whole time, and my usual amusement disappeared. I tried to distract myself with music, but that didn't bridge the strange distance between us. I nearly threw my phone at the window when an annoying song came on. Tension built in my chest. I looked for Hitoshi and saw him chatting happily with Kaminari, and a small sting of jealousy rose. I asked Shudo what he thought would happen during the trip, and he replied that it would probably be mostly training. When I asked if there might be anything fun, he frowned and suggested maybe campfire songs. I said I had been thinking more along the lines of scary stories, and he agreed it was possible. Then he went back to worrying and I felt on edge. When the bus finally stopped, relief turned into frustration when I realized we were at a cliff. My father stepped off the bus, followed by two women in distinctive catsuits I vaguely remembered from childhood. My father explained that the training camp began now and that it was meant to make everyone stronger. One of the women announced that they had 3 hours to reach the camp, and the others hurried to get off the bus. The woman in blue altered the ground beneath us so it gave way. I braced and fell, catching myself at the last second. Shinszo called out anxiously for me to be careful, and I let him know I would be. I scowled, irritated by the whole situation, and Uraraka's loud shriek grated on me, leaving me feeling tense and annoyed. I cradled my head as a headache began. I kept repeating an expletive to myself because a mud creature had started charging at us. I looked at Sho and decided he could handle himself. I muttered that I was leaving before I floated away. Halfway up, a pterodactyl-like creature barreled toward me. I shouted in frustration and used my shadows to send it flying apart. One after another, they kept coming. After defeating several, I started to get creative. Once, I forced 2 of the pterodactyls into each other as if they were colliding planes. Another time, I pushed one so high it vanished into the sky. Soon I reached the campsite where Dad and the 3 pro-heroes were. I landed gently near them. One of the pro-heroes exclaimed that it was cool I had arrived already. I mumbled that I was present, and my father teased me by calling me a problem child. I ignored him and sat down to look at the skyline. By the time the rest of the class arrived, the sun was starting to set. I could hear them before I saw them. Shinszo spotted me and immediately ran over to check on me. Shinszo asked if I was okay and reached to touch my face, but I jerked away. He looked surprised. I told him I was fine and not to worry. Kirishima complained about being hungry, and I laughed as I helped him up, doing my best to keep my temper in check with Shinszo. Kirishima thanked me and joked about me being manly. I told him it was no problem. While we ate, Shinszo hovered nearby like a worried guardian and said it would be fine. He pointed out the cut I had from the mud creatures, and I insisted I had had worse. Shinszo pressed, observing that I had been distant and closed off all day and asking me to talk. I blinked, confused, and he called my name to get my attention. I stood and put my plate in the sink, then walked into the woods without looking back. I did not know if he was following me, and I did not care. A crunch behind me answered that question. I stopped and turned to find his worried face in the dark. Shinszo ran up and hugged me. My eyes stung and I pushed away. I told him he could not just do that. He asked if I meant he could not hug me, and I said no. I demanded he talk instead. I told him he talked about wanting me to be more open, but then acted strangely all week, and I asked how I was supposed to feel when he did that. He looked pained. I sighed and flew away, cursing under my breath. The others were getting ready to go into the baths. Kirishima told Deku they had been about to go in without him. I said I was going to bed, looking down so no one could see my tears. Bakugo teased that if the nerd said he wasn't going, then he wasn't going, and the others called good night as they left. After they left, I went to the cabin lodge and tried to calm down, sitting on the ground against a wall. I relaxed and stared at the moon as a late breeze gently ruffled my hair. It was peaceful. A kid I had seen earlier appeared and remarked that I was kind of dumb and should be hanging out with my friends. When I asked what he meant, he repeated that I should be with the other heroes. I asked if he was listening, and he accused me of only repeating him. I told him he was like the rest of the heroes, and he said he was still debating whether to become one because it seemed like a lot of work and drama. Joked about other reasons I had been at the hero school, and he accused me of not taking other people's safety seriously. I insisted I did take everyone's safety seriously. I ruffled his hair as a friendly gesture. He pushed my hand away and ran off, kicking me before he did. I groaned and held myself, thinking that had hurt. Shinszo found me again and sat down silently beside me. He apologized quietly. I said it was fine, but he refused to accept that and admitted he could not force me to talk if he himself did not open up. I leaned on his shoulder. He tensed, then slowly relaxed and gave a small laugh. He told me the truth about what had happened during the shopping trip for field trip supplies. Shigaraki had been there. Shudo explained that when I had gone to the bathroom, Shigaraki had approached him and threatened everyone if Shudo said anything, and then started ranting about killing heroes. Shudo had reported it to my father but had avoided escalating the situation. That was why the location had changed. I thanked him and hugged him in response. He hummed in acknowledgement. The next day moved quickly. Everyone had to push the limits of their quirks. I stretched my shadows to test how far and how long they could extend. By the end of the day, everyone felt exhausted. Monoma's snark kept spirits up enough to bicker with him. At dinner, they announced everyone had to cook for themselves. I tried to avoid it, worried I would ruin the food, but Bakugo taunted me about not even knowing how to cut an onion and called it basic cooking skill. His taunting led to an accident in the kitchen and I ended up injuring my finger. Bakugo laughed until Kirishima hit him, and the hit shut him up. I sat down and handed Shudo a bowl of curry. Shudo took Izuku's finger and pressed a brief, affectionate kiss to it, which made Izuku blush. Izuku called Shudo by his nickname, and Shudo thanked Izuku for the curry. Izuku answered and then noticed a small boy standing alone. When their eyes met, the boy ran off. Izuku tried to get Shudo's attention, but Koda kept worrying aloud about whether the boy had eaten and if he would be all right alone. Shudo nudged Izuku's shoulder and asked if he was okay. Izuku said he was fine and explained that the boy with the dino horns made him want to go after him. Shudo suggested giving the boy some curry, since he had not seen him eat. Izuku told Shudo he loved him, gave a quick, affectionate peck on the cheek, and took his curry before heading out. Izuku followed the footprints until he found Koda sitting on a cliff. Izuku offered the boy a bowl of curry, holding it out to him. Koda jumped in surprise, then glared and demanded how Izuku had found the place. Izuku explained that he had followed the footprints and asked if Koda wanted the curry. Koda snapped that he was fine and did not want Izuku's food, accusing Izuku and his hero friends of being there to train their quirks and showing contempt for them. Izuku sat down beside him and pointed out that rejecting quirks entirely would only hurt Koda. He suggested that people might be flawed but Koda could choose not to follow the worst of their behavior. Koda told him to go away. Izuku left the food with a gentle reminder to be safe and walked away. I concentrated back on my work. I breathed with the shadows, allowing them to flow as freely as they wished. They slithered behind Mina and through the caves, reaching toward Tokoyami and his shadow almost connecting with Dark Shadow but not quite able to grasp the sentient being. I felt a surge of frustration from Dark Shadow. After all, the shadows were one with me and I with them. I shifted the tendrils of power to fluctuate gently as if trying to soothe the creature. When it did not calm, I drew my power back and focused on finding Shudo using only my senses. I felt the hum of the earth and the tiny shifts in direction when I neared someone. A couple of meters away, I thought then the bell rang, signaling lunch. I opened my eyes slowly in irritation and forced the shadows away. If they had feelings, they would be hurt. I rose from my meditative position and made my way toward Dad, holding up an injured finger to show him that it still hurt. Dad groaned that it was only a scratch and told me to cook. When I protested that it hurt, he pointed out my recent fall from a building and dismissed my complaint, calling me insufferable before pushing me toward the canteen. Class 1B was already there. I mostly ignored them. I saw little reason to mingle, especially since Monoma tended to be intolerable. Shudo caught up with me, panting and still tired from his quirk training. He asked what the class was making for lunch, and I told him to ask Kaken. He looked confused, so I explained that Kaken was in a bad mood and it was best not to bother him unless one had a hardening quirk and a name that started with K. When Shudo asked who else to ask, I shrugged. Monoma decided to come over and taunt us, claiming that 1A acted superior and that some of us had failed exams. He jeered that we were not as great as we thought. I stared him down until he shifted under my gaze, searching for more insults. A red-haired girl arrived and, without hesitation, struck Monoma on the back of the neck, knocking him out. She apologized profusely as she scooped up his limp form and took him away. I stood, put my dishes away, and left the exchange behind. After lunch, I pulled Shudo into the woods, laughing as I did. When he asked where we were going, I said we were heading to a tree and teased that it was to be alone together. He smiled and led me deeper into the trees before pressing me gently against a trunk. He looked into my eyes and, softly and earnestly, confessed that he loved me. He said it again, and I felt the sincerity of it. I tried to respond, but he reached up and kissed me. The kiss was tender and steady, not rushed. There was a moment of vulnerability, and I felt my face heat. Shinszo paused, clearly surprised, then quickly gathered himself. He apologized for making me uncomfortable and offered comfort instead. We shared an awkward, reassuring hug that eased the embarrassment, then fell into a quiet, intimate moment together. They held each other close, exchanging another gentle kiss before settling down on the leaves. If it had not been for Shinszo, I might have stumbled, but he supported me. He kissed my forehead, smiled, and pulled us down onto the grass, cradling me in his arms as we rested together. His face pressed into my hair. He and I sat like that for a while, exchanging a few quiet declarations of love. He kissed my head contentedly before getting up and told me we should head back. He offered his hand and I took it, my voice too hoarse to speak. He suggested I adjust my hoodie, and I blushed and nodded. We went to the camp lodge. I hurried past the boys on the bunks to change. Shinszo attempted to greet me, but Shinszo intervened to give me privacy. I slipped into the bathroom and changed into a fresh pair of jeans, tucking the other clothes into my suitcase to avoid embarrassment. I stepped out to find Shinszo smiling broadly. I grumbled under my breath and quietly stowed the spare clothes. I sat on Shinszo's bed and we played cards until dinner. I felt so happy with him and wished I could stay with him forever. Sweat fell down my brow. The sun was becoming insufferable, and it distracted me from a heaviness in the air that I couldn't name. Now wasn't the time to get distracted. My father would be furious if he found me slacking. Besides, I could take down All Might. What was the worst that could happen? A scrape? A reptile had slithered its way through the forest and now it lay in wait, always out of sight of its enemy. Aizawa and the pussycats had organized a test of courage. It was meant to pass the time and give the teachers something to laugh about. A couple of students who hadn't passed the exams were pulled aside for remedial lessons. The goal of the test was simple: find a card with your name on it, or be scared. Class 1B had gone first, trying to frighten the students. I hadn't been paired with Shinszo, I had been paired with Uraraka. She seemed different to me lately, but I tucked my worry away. She wasn't someone to worry about. The worst she could do was whine. I waited my turn and watched my childhood friend walk into the woods with his boyfriend. Izuku called out to neither of them in particular, telling them not to get too scared. Bakugo snapped his neck back and told him he wasn't going to be scared of this lame stuff. Bakugo proclaimed that he was going to retrieve his card faster than me. Beside him, Uraraka let out a dry laugh. I eyed her and waved goodbye to Shinszo. Bakugo stepped on the leaves, listening to them quietly crunch under his feet. Shinszo kept the silence too. He didn't know the entirety of Izuku and Bakugo's relationship, but he knew that the blonde had done some terrible things to Izuku. Shinszo would never forgive Bakugo for that. After a few minutes of silence, Bakugo accused Shinszo of liking that nerd a lot. Shinszo looked up at the stars and admitted that he did care for him but didn't think the feelings were mutual. Bakugo clicked his tongue and shifted away, letting the silence creep back in. I watched Uraraka grow fidgety. It made sense that she was anxious. Our turn was almost next, so I chalked her restlessness up to nerves and ignored it. Shinszo had already gone in with his partner, and Tsuyu and Sato had just gone in. We were next. I felt something amiss in the air again. No one else seemed to notice the way it thickened or the slight change in temperature. I sighed and crossed my arms. It was no use to worry when there was no reason to. Aizawa always told me I worried too much for my own good. I let the dropping feeling in my stomach dissipate before turning back toward the tree line. It was finally our turn. Uraraka tapped my shoulder shyly and asked if she could hold my hand, stuttering as she did. I wanted to say no, but I nodded and held out my hand. She took it with glee and said she was really scared, drawing out her syllables. I replied absent-mindedly that I understood. She fiddled with something in her pocket as we walked. Shinszo felt a tap on his shoulder, and then he was gone. Bakugo watched as Shinszo disappeared into thin air. A man standing behind him flicked a marble up and into his pocket. Bakugo was stunned and moved without thinking, blasting himself toward the villain. He refused to let that villain take away the one good thing that had happened to Deku. No, not again, not ever. 1 second Izuku was looking at a strange tree, the next there was only darkness. He pushed against the black veil that blocked his way to consciousness until his jaw tightened and his efforts stalled. A cough sounded behind him. Izuku turned and saw Shinszo. He moved forward and hugged him, then pulled back to study his boyfriend's face because something felt wrong. He shoved the imposter away and demanded to know who he was. The figure insisted he was Shinszo, Izuku's boyfriend. Izuku shook his head and scrutinized the figure from head to toe, noting small things that did not match. The figure reacted with a desperate embrace. Izuku closed his eyes and, wondering if he was imagining things, allowed himself to relax into the hold for a moment. Explosions shot toward the fleeing figure as the pursuer tried to catch Icy Hot. The pursuer reminded himself that he had taken everything from Deku: his childhood, his happiness, and the chance to make friends. He needed to get that boy back. He could not forgive himself if he failed. The magician-like man leapt over the trees with a blue marble tucked into his pocket. The pursuer fired blast after blast at the ground to close the distance, but the man moved with evasive agility. When the pursuer drew within an arm's reach, the man turned and called out that the pursuer was fast. The pursuer demanded that the man hand over the marble, using a biting nickname. The man sneered and said he was following the boss orders and that he needed the child, then shot away, doubling the distance between them. Gritting his teeth, the pursuer unleashed another powerful explosion. His hands began to burn and his arms grew fatigued, but he pushed on for Izuku. Memories from earlier flickered through his mind. Icy Hot's flat, distant speech contrasted painfully with the warmth the boy once showed him. He admitted to himself that he had liked Izuku. He had been the first friend, the biggest supporter, and at one time a quiet crush. His uncontrolled power had not only destroyed objects, it had also shattered their relationship. If he could undo what he had done, he would, but he could not. Saving Icy Hot was the only thing he could still do. He promised himself he would stop trying to pry into Izuku's life. He no longer had the right. Just as he was closing in, a pink gas seeped through the woods and spread into the night sky. He covered his nose, but the cloud sapped his momentum and drowsiness crept over him. He fought to push himself back up with explosions, but his hands were too damaged to generate much force. Only weak sparks remained, and they were barely enough to arrest his fall. When he hit the ground, a sharp pain lanced through his arm and he realized it had been badly injured. He forced himself to stay silent, biting down on the urge to cry out. He had failed to keep Icy Hot safe. He had failed Izuku. Izuku hugged Shinszo tightly and told him that he was adorable. Shinszo blushed and called Izuku strange. Izuku laughed softly and asked whether Shinszo knew where they were. Shinszo replied that it did not matter because they were together, and he suggested they could figure things out later. Izuku felt a breath on the back of his neck and turned, surprised at the sudden change in the atmosphere. He was unsettled and sensed that something was wrong. The expression on Shinszo's face shifted into a glare that made Izuku's stomach twist. Someone else in the scene panicked as the situation accelerated faster than they could handle. They wondered if a hero was nearby, whether anyone could see them, and how to get away.